Tonight we tell the story of a traitor, or a hero, or both. It depends entirely on who you ask, and in the Tau Empire the answer to that question can get you killed. His name is Chassoviola Shovakais Montir. The humans of the Imperium call him Commander Farsight. His own people once called him the hero of Viola, the greatest military mind the Firecast had ever produced. The living embodiment of everything the Tau Empire believed it could become. Now they call him the Great Traitor, he who renounced the greater good. His statues have been torn down. His name has been erased from official histories. His image is forbidden in every sept world from Tau to Borkan. The Ethereal High Council, the supreme ruling body of the Tau Empire, has declared him a renegade and forbidden all communications between the Empire and the territory he now controls. And yet, by all accounts, he lives. 300 years old in a species that rarely sees 50. Allegedly still leading an independent civilization on the far side of the Damocles Gulf. Still fighting. Still winning, still believing in something that the Tau Empire's rulers have decided is more dangerous than any alien invasion or imperial crusade. The idea that the greater good does not need the Ethereals. That is the heresy of Commander Farsight. Not that he betrayed his people, but that he proved they could survive without their masters. And in a civilization built entirely on obedience to those masters, that proof is more frightening than any weapon he carries, more dangerous than the ancient alien sword that has somehow kept him alive for centuries past his natural span. This is his story, the full story. From the fire academies of Viola to the blood-soaked ruins of Arthas Moloch, from the proudest son of the Tau Empire to its most wanted fugitive. From a commander who believed in everything his civilization stood for to a leader who discovered that everything he believed was built on a lie. Close your eyes if you like. This one is long. This one is complicated. And this one does not have a clean ending. Because the story of Commander Farsight is still being written in fire and in blood, on the far edge of the galaxy. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin with the civilization that made him, and the empire he left behind. The Tau are, by the standards of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, impossibly young. Their recorded history spans barely 6,000 years, in a galaxy where the Necrons slept for 60 million years and the Eldar ruled for millions more. The Tau are infants. Newcomers, a species that was still hunting with stone-tipped spears when the Horus Heresy tore the Imperium apart. Their homeworld is a dusty, arid planet called Tau, located in the far galactic east, well beyond the primary borders of the Imperium. It is not a remarkable world, not rich in resources, not strategically positioned, not blessed with any of the cosmic significance that seems to attach itself to worlds like Terra or Makrag or Baal. It is simply a world where, against all odds, a species of short-lived, near-sighted, blue-skinned aliens evolved a level of intelligence and social cohesion that would eventually carry them to the stars. The Tau are divided into 5 castes, and this division is not merely cultural, it is biological. Over thousands of years of selective breeding, the castes have diverged into what are functionally different subspecies, each one physically and psychologically adapted to its role. The Fire caste are the warriors, tall for Tau, muscular, aggressive, bred for combat. They are the soldiers, the commanders, the military arm of the Empire. They train from childhood in the fire academies, learning the art of warfare with a dedication that borders on religious devotion. Their lives are short even by Tau standards, because the Firecast does not retire. They fight until they die, or until they are too old and broken to fight, at which point they become instructors, passing their knowledge to the next generation before their bodies finally give out. The Earthcast are the builders and scientists. Stocky, patient, methodical, they design the battlesuits, the weapons, the ships, the infrastructure that sustains the Empire. They are the engineers and the researchers, the ones who turn theoretical physics into pulse rifles, and who build the orbital stations that serve as the Tau's primary method of off-world habitation. The Tau do not share the Imperium's terror of artificial intelligence, and the Earthcast has pushed the boundaries of drone technology and automated systems far beyond anything the Mechanicus would tolerate. The Watercast are the diplomats and administrators. Thin, elegant, silver-tongued. They negotiate treaties, manage trade, handle communications between septs, and serve as the public face of the Tau Empire to the galaxy at large. When the Tau encounter a new species, it is the Watercast who make first contact, who assess whether the newcomers can be brought into the greater good through diplomacy, or whether the Firecast will need to be called in. More worlds have been absorbed into the Tau Empire through the persuasion of the Watercast than through the weapons of the Firecast, and the Watercast considers this a point of considerable pride. The Aircast are the pilots and spacers, tall, thin, with elongated limbs adapted to low-gravity environments. Many Aircast Tau spend their entire lives in space, aboard the ships and stations that form the Tau's interstellar network. They are the navigators, the fighter pilots, the fleet commanders. Their bodies have adapted to the void so thoroughly that many Aircast cannot comfortably exist in standard gravity for extended periods. And then there are the Ethereals. The Ethereals are the ruling caste, and their existence is one of the great mysteries of Tau civilization. They appeared approximately 6,000 years ago, during a period of savage intercaste warfare that was threatening to destroy Tau society entirely. The four castes had been fighting each other for generations, each one convinced that its way of life was superior, each one refusing to submit to the authority of the others. Then the Ethereals simply appeared. No one knows where they came from. No one knows how they evolved, or whether they evolved at all, or whether they were engineered by some outside force for precisely this purpose. What is known is that when the Ethereals spoke, the other castes listened. The Ethereals were not the strongest caste, nor the smartest, nor the most persuasive. And yet the other castes could not refuse them. There is something about the Ethereals, some quality of their presence, that compels obedience in other Tau. It is not mind control in the crude sense, it is subtler than that, more insidious. A Tau in the presence of an Ethereal feels a deep instinctive need to follow, to serve, to obey. The desire feels natural, almost pleasant. It does not feel like coercion. It feels like faith, like purpose, like the truest expression of the greater good. The Imperium has theories about what the Ethereals actually are. Some Inquisitors believe they are a genetically engineered ruling caste, possibly created by an older and more advanced species to control the Tau. Others believe the Ethereals secrete pheromones, or produce some other biochemical signal that triggers a compliance response in other Tau. A few radical theorists have suggested that the Ethereals might be an entirely separate species that infiltrated and subverted Tau society from within, steering it toward their own purposes. The Tau, for the most part, do not ask these questions. They do not need to. The Ethereals are the guiding light of the greater good, the wise counselors who speak for the collective destiny of the Tau species. And to question their authority is to question the foundation of everything the Tau Empire has achieved. The greater good itself is the philosophical bedrock of Tau civilization. It is not a religion. The Tau do not have gods, do not pray, do not worship. The greater good is a philosophy, a principle, an organizing idea that holds that the needs of the collective always outweigh the needs of the individual. Every Tau is expected to sacrifice personal ambition, personal comfort, and if necessary, personal survival for the benefit of the species as a whole. The greater good is not optional. It is not debated. It is the lens through which every decision is made. From the deployment of fleets to the allocation of food rations. It is also, from the perspective of Commander Farsight, the most effective tool of control ever devised by a ruling class that does not want its subjects to realize they are being controlled. But that realization would come later, much later. When Oshova was young, when he was just a boy named Sho in the fire academies of Viola, he believed in the greater good with all his heart. He believed because he had never been given a reason not to. But that realization was a lifetime away for the boy in the fire academy. The young Sho saw the greater good the way most Tau saw it, as an obvious, self-evident truth, the natural organizing principle of a civilization that worked. He saw the castes cooperating. He saw technology advancing. He saw the empire expanding, bringing new worlds and new species into the fold, spreading civilization across the stars with a purpose and efficiency that seemed to validate everything the Ethereals taught. He did not ask why the other castes obeyed the Ethereals so completely. He did not notice the subtle edge of compulsion in the Ethereals' influence, because he had never experienced its absence. A fish does not notice water. A Tau raised under ethereal authority does not notice the gentle, constant pressure that shapes every decision, every impulse, every moment of apparent free will into a pattern that serves the ruling caste's agenda. This is the genius of the Ethereals' control. It does not feel like control. It feels like clarity, like purpose, like knowing exactly what you are supposed to do and feeling good about doing it. The Tau who serve the Ethereals do not feel enslaved. They feel fulfilled. And when a Tau steps outside that influence for the first time, as Farsight eventually would, the experience is not liberation. It is vertigo. The sudden, nauseating awareness that the ground you have been standing on your entire life is not solid ground at all, but a carefully maintained illusion, and that the real ground is somewhere far below, and the fall is very, very long. And Viola gave him many reasons to believe. Viola is one of the most important sept worlds in the Tau Empire, and the name itself tells you everything you need to know about its character. Viola translates roughly as hot-blooded. It is a world of warriors, a sept that has produced more decorated firecast commanders than any other, a culture that values martial excellence with an intensity that sometimes makes the other septs uncomfortable. The fire academies of Viola are legendary. They are the finest military training institutions in the Tau Empire. Facilities where the most promising young firecast members are pushed to the absolute limits of their physical and mental abilities. The training is harsh. The expectations are brutal. The washout rate is high. Those who survive emerge as some of the most skilled and disciplined warriors in the galaxy, ready to serve the greater good with a dedication that puts even the most fanatical Imperial Guard regiment to shame. Sho entered the academy as a child, as all Firecast children do, and from the very first day it was clear that he was different. Not physically. Sho was not particularly large or strong for a Firecast youth. He was not the fastest or the most aggressive. In the purely physical metrics that the academies use to assess raw potential, Sho was above average but not extraordinary. His mind, though, was something else entirely. Sho absorbed information the way a sponge absorbs water. He memorized the entire Code of Fire, the comprehensive manual of Tau military doctrine, in a fraction of the time it took his peers. He did not merely memorize it. He understood it, which was a far rarer achievement. He could see the principles behind the tactics, the logic that connected one doctrine to another, the way that individual techniques combined into larger strategic patterns. More impressively, he could see the gaps. He could identify the situations where the Code of Fire was incomplete, where its doctrines did not account for an unexpected variable, where a creative commander could exploit the difference between what the manual said and what the battlefield demanded. This is an extraordinarily dangerous talent in a military culture that prizes discipline and adherence to doctrine, and in a lesser student it might have been punished. In Sho, it was recognized for what it was, the early stirrings of genuine tactical genius. What set Sho apart was not merely his ability to absorb information, but his ability to synthesize it. He could take two unrelated tactical principles, two techniques that had never been combined before, and see the connection between them, the way that one could complement the other, the way that a defensive maneuver could be transformed into an offensive one by changing a single variable. His mind worked in patterns that his instructors had not seen before, patterns that suggested a depth of tactical intuition that went beyond training and into something closer to art. He was also stubborn. When he believed he was right, no amount of institutional pressure could change his mind. He would argue with instructors who outranked him. He would challenge simulation parameters that he believed were unrealistic. He would refuse to accept a tactical solution that produced the correct outcome through flawed reasoning, insisting that the process mattered as much as the result. This stubbornness made him difficult. It also made him exceptional, because a mind that accepts answers without questioning the methods that produced them is a mind that will eventually accept a wrong answer and not notice. He spent long hours in the Montier Battle Dome, the Academy's advanced combat simulation facility, running scenarios over and over, testing his ideas against the machine's increasingly complex challenges. He deciphered the communication codes used by his superiors, not to spy on them, but to study their decision-making in real time, to understand how experienced commanders translated theory into practice under pressure. His instructors were simultaneously impressed and unsettled by this behavior. Impressed because it showed initiative and intellectual depth. Unsettled because a student who could decode officer communications was a student who might one day decode things he was not supposed to see. When Sho graduated from the basic academy, he was immediately flagged for advanced battlesuit training. The XV-8 Crisis Battlesuit is the Tau Firecast's signature weapon system, a humanoid combat walker roughly twice the height of a Tau, armed with an array of weapon systems and capable of jet-assisted flight. Piloting a crisis suit is one of the most demanding skills in Tau military doctrine. It requires split-second decision-making, spatial awareness, weapon management, and the ability to coordinate with other suit pilots in fluid, three-dimensional combat environments. Sho took to it with an ease that alarmed his trainers. It was during his battlesuit training that Sho first came to the attention of Commander Farsight, the greatest military teacher the Tau Empire had ever produced. Farsight was old, ancient by Tau standards, a veteran of more campaigns than most Firecast warriors could name. He had spent the latter part of his long career teaching, passing his accumulated knowledge to the next generation of commanders, and his students went on to become the most celebrated military leaders in Tau history. Farsight's teaching was not conventional. He did not simply drill tactics and formations. He taught his students to think, to adapt, to see warfare as a living, evolving system rather than a set of rigid rules. He taught them that the greatest enemy a commander faced was not the alien across the battlefield, but the assumptions inside their own head. He taught them to question their own certainties, to consider possibilities that their training had not prepared them for, and to trust their instincts when the situation demanded something that the manual did not cover. Farsight took 3 students as his personal protégés, the brightest minds of their generation. The first was Sho, the prodigy from Viola. The second was Oshasera, who would later become Commander Shadowson, a tactical genius whose mastery of the patient hunter strategy, the Kauyon, would make her the most celebrated commander of the Third Sphere expansion. The third was Shaso Kais, a warrior of exceptional skill and ferocity whose own story is worth a telling of its own. From the very beginning, Sho and Shadowson were rivals. It was not personal, at least not at first. It was the inevitable friction between 2 exceptionally gifted students competing for the approval of a mentor they both revered. In the simulation domes, Shadowson and Sho consistently outperformed every other student, and their head-to-head scores were so close that neither could claim clear superiority. Shadowson favored patience, misdirection, and the devastating ambush. Sho favored speed, aggression, and the decisive strike. Both approaches worked, both were brilliantly executed, and both students, in their different ways, absorbed Farsight's deeper lessons about adaptability and creative thinking. But Farsight saw something in Sho that he did not see in Shadowson. Not greater talent necessarily, perhaps greater independence. A willingness to challenge, to push back, to question the fundamental premises of a tactical situation rather than simply finding the best solution within the existing doctrine. Shadowson was brilliant within the system. Sho was brilliant at seeing beyond it. It was this quality that made Sho Farsight's most favored student. It was also this quality that would eventually make him the most dangerous person in the Tau Empire. Farsight was aging. The Tau lifespan is cruelly short, and even the greatest minds are not exempt from its mathematics. Farsight knew his time was limited, and he poured everything he had into his students, every insight, every tactical principle, every hard-won lesson from a career that had spanned the Tau Empire's greatest period of expansion. The Tau Empire had grown through a series of coordinated military and diplomatic campaigns known as the Spheres of Expansion. The first sphere of expansion, launched shortly after the Ethereals united the castes, had established the Tau's initial interstellar holdings, the core sept worlds that formed the backbone of the Empire. It was a period of cautious growth, of testing the limits of Tau technology and Tau ambition, of learning what it meant to be an interstellar civilization. The second sphere of expansion was more aggressive. The Tau pushed their borders outward in every direction, absorbing alien species and human frontier colonies into the greater good. It was during the second sphere that the Tau encountered the Orcs in significant numbers for the first time, and it was during the second sphere that the Tau's military doctrine Its emphasis on combined arms, drone support, and battlesuit warfare was refined into the form that Puritide taught to his students. The second sphere also brought the Tau into contact with the Imperium of Man, and it was this contact that would eventually trigger the Damocles Crusade and everything that followed. But that was in the future. For now, the young Shou was absorbing everything his teacher could give him, filling his mind with strategies and counter-strategies, with principles of warfare and principles of leadership, with the understanding that a commander's greatest tool was not a weapon but a mind. Before any of that could happen, though, Shou needed a war, a real war, not the simulations and training exercises that had defined his career so far. He needed the chaos of a real battlefield, with real enemies and real consequences, to prove that his theoretical genius could translate into practical results. The war found him on a dusty, wind-scoured colony world called Arkunasha, a place that no one in the Tau Empire had paid much attention to before the Orcs arrived. And it found him ready. Arkunasha was a colony world on the edge of Tau-controlled space, a wind-swept planet of red oxide deserts and deep twisting canyons carved into the landscape by millennia of erosion. It was not a wealthy world, not a strategically critical one. It was a frontier settlement, the kind of place that the Tau Empire established during its periods of expansion, a foothold in unclaimed space, a stepping stone toward whatever lay beyond. It was also directly in the path of a war. The Orc warlord known as Toothjaw had been building his forces for years, conquering smaller Orc tribes and absorbing their fighters into his growing horde. By the time his Wa'arg turned its attention to Arkunasha, Toothjaw commanded an army that outnumbered the colony's fire-cast garrison by a factor that defied comfortable analysis. The Orcs came in a green tide, in crude but functional ships, in landing craft that were more scrap metal than engineering. And they hit Arkunasha with the enthusiasm of a species that considers planetary invasion a recreational activity. The garrison was not prepared. How could it be? Arkunasha was a colony, not a fortress. Its fire-cast presence was a defensive force, not a campaign army. The Tau defenders had pulse rifles and battlesuits and drones and all the technological advantages that the Tau Empire brought to bear against its enemies, but they were outnumbered beyond any reasonable hope of victory. Conventional doctrine said they should retreat, consolidate, call for reinforcements, and return in force once the odds were more favorable. Commander Shou, newly arrived on Arkunasha with orders to assess the situation and coordinate the defense, had a different idea. He would not retreat. He would fight, and he would win. Not by matching the Orcs in brute strength, which was impossible, but by exploiting the one advantage that the Tau would always have over the Orcs. Intelligence. Orcs are simple creatures driven by aggression and the desire for a good fight. They are not stupid exactly, but they are predictable. An Orc warlord who sees an enemy will charge it. An Orc warband that smells blood will pursue it. An Orc army that is challenged will respond with overwhelming force, regardless of whether that response is tactically sound. This predictability is the Orc's greatest weakness, and Shou intended to exploit it with surgical precision. He studied the terrain of Arkunasha. He memorized the canyon networks that cut through the oxide deserts, the narrow passes that could funnel an army into kill zones, the high ground that offered commanding views of the approaches, the dead ends and false trails that could trap a force that committed to the wrong path. He built a map of the planet's geography in his mind, and then he built a war plan on top of it. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Sho would not try to hold ground against the orcs. Holding ground against a numerically superior orc force is how you die. Instead, he would use the terrain to fragment the orc army, drawing elements of it into the canyon networks through a series of feints and retreats, separating the horde into smaller, more manageable groups, and then destroying those groups in carefully prepared ambushes. The key was speed. The Tau would never stay in one place long enough for the orcs to bring their full numbers to bear. They would strike, inflict casualties, and vanish before the orcs could respond. They would appear at one end of a canyon and disappear from the other, leaving the orcs to chase shadows through a maze of red rock while Tau marksmen picked them off from positions the greenskins could not reach. It worked. Not immediately, not cleanly, and not without cost. But it worked. The Arkunasha War became a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Sho divided his forces into mobile hunter-killer teams, each one small enough to move quickly through the canyon networks, but powerful enough to destroy an isolated orc warband. He positioned sensor drones at key choke points throughout the desert, building a surveillance network that gave him a comprehensive view of orc movement across the entire continent. When an orc column entered a canyon, Sho knew about it within minutes. When it reached the kill zone he had prepared, his teams were already in position. The ambushes were devastating. Tau marksmen firing from the canyon rims could pour pulse fire down onto orc columns trapped in the narrow defiles below, and the orcs, compressed by the terrain and unable to spread out or flank, could do nothing but die or retreat. When they retreated, Sho's battlesuit teams were waiting at the canyon exits, cutting off escape routes and turning retreats into routes. He used decoy forces to lure the orcs into unfavorable terrain, deploying small teams that would engage the greenskins and then withdraw, drawing the orcs deeper and deeper into the canyon networks, further and further from their supply lines and reinforcements. The orcs, driven by their instinct to chase a fleeing enemy, followed every time. They followed into dead-end canyons where Tau marksmen waited on the walls above. They followed into narrow passes where battlesuit teams dropped from the sky and hit them from 3 directions at once. They followed into killing grounds so perfectly designed that the orc commanders never realized they were being herded until the firing started. Sho's forces never fought a set-piece battle. They never lined up against the orcs and exchanged fire in the open. Every engagement was an ambush, a trap, a carefully orchestrated sequence of feints and strikes designed to maximize orc casualties while minimizing Tau losses. The orcs were infuriated. They were used to enemies who stood and fought, who built walls and hid behind them, who could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers and savage aggression. This enemy was different. This enemy was always somewhere else, always one step ahead, always attacking from a direction the orcs had not expected, and withdrawing before the greenskins could close to the brutal melee combat they excelled at. Sho spent months in the canyons of Arkunasha, months of constant movement, constant planning, constant adjustment. He learnt to read the orcs the way a hunter reads the tracks of its prey. He could predict their movements before they made them. He could anticipate their reactions to his feints with an accuracy that seemed almost precognitive. It was this ability, this talent for seeing several moves ahead, for understanding the enemy's response before the enemy understood it themselves, that earned him the name his people would remember, Oshova, Farsight, the far-seeing one. But the war was not without its dark moments. The orcs were too numerous to be defeated through attrition alone. For every warband that Sho destroyed in the canyons, 2 more arrived from the landing zones. The Tau garrison was being worn down. Supplies were running low. Replacement troops were not arriving fast enough, and the Orcs, for all their predictability, were learning. Warboss Toothjaw was not a fool, at least not by Orc standards. He began to adapt his tactics, sending smaller scout parties into the canyons first, using expendable Gretchen to trigger the Tau ambushes, keeping his main force back until the Tau positions were revealed. There came a point in the campaign when Sho found himself surrounded. His forces had been pushed back to the Argap Highlands, a natural fortress of elevated plateaus and narrow approaches that offered defensible ground, but also limited escape routes. The Orcs massed around the highlands in numbers that turned the desert green with their bodies. For the first time in the campaign, Sho could not maneuver. He could not feint. He could not vanish into the canyons. He was pinned, and the Orcs knew it. The siege of the Argap Highlands became the defining moment of the Arkunasha campaign, and it tested Sho in ways that no simulation, no academy exercise, and no tactical manual could have prepared him for. The Highlands were a natural fortress, a series of interconnected plateaus rising sharply from the desert floor, accessible only through a handful of steep, narrow approaches that a determined defender could hold against enormous numbers. Sho had chosen them deliberately as a fallback position, recognizing that if the mobile canyon warfare ever failed, he would need somewhere defensible to consolidate and hold. When the Orcs finally cornered him there, the Highlands became a crucible. The siege lasted weeks. Sho's forces held the approaches with pulse fire and drone strikes, turning the narrow paths to the plateaus into killing grounds. The Orcs threw themselves at the defenses with their characteristic disregard for casualties, and the bodies piled up in the passes, but there were always more. Always more green-skinned warriors climbing over the corpses of their fallen comrades. Always more crude vehicles grinding up the slopes. Always more warbands arriving from across the desert to join the fight. Sho held. He held because he had no choice, and because giving up was not in his nature. He rationed ammunition. He rotated his defenders to prevent exhaustion. He used the terrain to compensate for his lack of numbers, positioning his battlesuits at the most critical choke points and trusting his infantry to hold the secondary approaches. He improvised weapons from wreckage and spare parts. He adapted his tactics hour by hour as the Orc attacks shifted and probed for weaknesses. The Tau warriors on the Highlands fought with a desperation that transcended training and entered the territory of pure survival instinct. Pulse rifle power cells were rationed to 3 shots per cell, forcing marksmen to make every discharge count. Battlesuit pilots fought until their suits' power cores dipped into reserve, then withdrew to recharge while infantry held the line. Drone controllers deployed their charges in sacrificial patterns, sending gun drones into Orc formations as living grenades, their pulse carbines firing until the drones were destroyed and the self-destruct charges went off in the middle of the greenskin ranks. Farsight was everywhere. He moved from position to position in his crisis suit, appearing at whatever section of the defense was under the heaviest pressure, rallying his warriors with his presence and with the precise, devastating fire of his battlesuit's weapons. He did not give speeches. He did not make grand gestures. He simply showed up where the fighting was worst, fought until the immediate crisis was contained, and then moved to the next critical point. His warriors learned to watch for the flash of his jetpack engines in the smoke and the sight of their commander arriving at a beleaguered position became, over the course of the siege, a guarantee that the position would hold. The food ran out in the third week. Water filtration units, damaged by Orc artillery, began to fail in the fourth. By the fifth week, the defenders were drinking recycled condensation from their battlesuit cooling systems and eating nutrient pastes scraped from emergency ration packs that had been designed for a 3-day supply, not a month-long siege. And still, they held. And then the Ethereals ordered a retreat, not a counterattack, not a final stand. A withdrawal. The Ethereal Aun Shi arrived personally and informed Farsight that the Ethereal Council had decided to abandon Arkunasha. The colony would be evacuated over the coming years. Farsight's role was to fight a strictly defensive campaign, buying time for the civilian population and infrastructure to be relocated to safer worlds. Farsight was furious. He had held the Highlands against impossible odds. He had built a defense that was bleeding the Orcs white. Given time and reinforcements, he believed he could break the Wa'a entirely. But the Ethereals had made their decision, and Farsight, for all his growing doubts, was not yet ready to defy a direct Ethereal order. He obeyed, grudgingly, bitterly. But he obeyed. The evacuation of Arkunasha took years. Farsight fought a disciplined rearguard action, protecting the withdrawal of civilians and equipment while slowly ceding territory to the Orcs. It was the hardest kind of warfare, fighting not to win but to delay, watching ground he had bled for handed back to the enemy because someone in a council chamber on a distant world had decided the colony was not worth holding. And then something remarkable happened. With the Tau gone, with no enemy left to fight, the Orc Wa'a turned on itself. Without a common target to unite them, the greenskin factions fragmented and fell to infighting. Toothjaw's lieutenants turned on each other, fighting for dominance, and within months the Wa'a had destroyed itself more thoroughly than Farsight's forces ever could have. When the Firecast returned to Arkunasha a year later, the Orc presence had been reduced to less than 1/100th of its original size. The reconquest was almost trivially easy. The Arkunasha War made Commander Farsight famous. Not just famous, legendary. The Tau Empire's propaganda apparatus, managed with characteristic efficiency by the Watercast, presented the Arkunasha campaign as a triumph of the greater good, a demonstration of what Tau civilization could achieve when its warriors, its technology, and its philosophy worked in perfect harmony. Statues of Farsight were erected on sept worlds across the Empire. His tactics were studied in the fire academies. His name became synonymous with military excellence. But Farsight himself drew different lessons from Arkunasha than the ones the propaganda suggested. The first lesson was about close combat. The Tau as a species dislike close combat. Their military doctrine is built around ranged engagement, using superior firepower and technology to destroy enemies at a distance, before they can close to melee range. This makes sense for a species that is physically weaker than most of its enemies. A Tau fire warrior in hand-to-hand combat with an Orc is a dead Tau fire warrior. But Farsight had seen during the Arkunasha campaign that there were moments when close combat could not be avoided. Moments when the Orcs got too close, when the lines collapsed, when the only choice was to fight hand-to-hand or die. In those moments, the Tau's reluctance to train for melee combat became a liability. Farsight began to think about ways to address this, to develop close combat techniques and weapons that a Tau in a battlesuit could use when ranged engagement was no longer possible. This was, by Tau standards, a radical idea. Almost heretical. The doctrine of the Firecast was explicit: engage at range, maintain distance, use technology to compensate for physical limitations. A commander who advocated for close combat training was challenging the fundamental assumptions of Tau military philosophy. Farsight was not deterred. He had seen the cost of those assumptions written in the blood of his warriors, and he was not the kind of commander who let doctrine override evidence. The second lesson was subtler, and it would take years to fully crystallize. The Arkunasha War taught Farsight about the gap between theory and reality. The Code of Fire, the doctrinal manual that every Tau commander memorized and followed, was a brilliant document. But it was also incomplete. It was written for a universe that behaved according to certain assumptions about enemy behavior, about terrain, about the relationship between firepower and maneuver. The Arkunasha canyons had exposed the limits of those assumptions. The orcs had not behaved the way the code predicted. The terrain had demanded improvisations that the code did not account for, and Farsight's greatest victories had come not from following the manual, but from departing from it. This insight that doctrine was a starting point rather than an end point was dangerous in a culture that valued obedience and conformity. It suggested that the people who wrote the doctrines might not have all the answers. It suggested that individual judgment, informed by direct experience, could sometimes be more valuable than received wisdom, even wisdom handed down by the ruling caste. And that thought led directly to the third lesson, the one that troubled Farsight most of all. The Ethereals. Farsight had been assigned Ethereal advisors during the Arkunasha campaign. This was standard practice. Every major Tau military operation included Ethereal oversight, both to provide spiritual guidance to the troops and to ensure that military decisions aligned with the broader goals of the greater good, as defined by the Ethereal Council. Farsight respected the Ethereals. He believed in their wisdom. He accepted their authority as part of the natural order of Tau civilization. But he had noticed during the campaign that the Ethereals' contributions to military planning were not always helpful. Their advice was sometimes contradictory, sometimes based on political considerations rather than tactical ones, sometimes simply wrong. And the Firecast officers who received this advice could not ignore it, because ignoring an Ethereal's guidance was, in the culture of the Tau, essentially unthinkable. This created situations where good commanders made bad decisions because an Ethereal told them to, and Farsight found this deeply troubling. Not because he doubted the Ethereal's intentions, which he still believed were good, but because he had seen how blind obedience to authority could get soldiers killed in situations where independent judgment might have saved them. He filed this observation away. He did not act on it. Not yet. He was still a loyal son of the Empire, still a believer in the greater good, still a commander who followed orders and trusted his superiors. But the seed of doubt had been planted there in the red dust of Arkunasha, and it would not stop growing. The Arkunasha War was behind him. The next war was coming, and it would be unlike anything the Tau had ever faced. The humans were coming. The Imperium of Man had known about the Tau for some time, in the vague, disinterested way that a continent-spanning empire might be aware of a small trading post on a distant frontier. The Tau were aliens. The Imperium did not like aliens, but the Tau were also small, located on the far edge of the galaxy, and not yet significant enough to warrant the kind of focused attention that the Imperium reserved for existential threats. That changed when the Tau began absorbing human worlds. The Tau's second sphere expansion had pushed their borders outward into regions of space where human colonies existed, worlds that had been isolated from the Imperium for centuries or millennia. Worlds where the people had forgotten what it meant to be subjects of the God Emperor. The Watercast offered these humans a choice. Join the greater good and enjoy the benefits of Tau technology, Tau governance, and Tau protection. Or continue to exist in the squalid isolation that the Imperium had condemned them to. Many said yes. The greater good was, from the perspective of a human colonist who had been eating recycled protein paste and dying of treatable diseases for generations, a remarkably attractive offer. The Tau did not burn heretics. They did not conscript children. They did not worship a corpse on a golden chair. They offered clean water, advanced medicine, functional government, and a philosophy that valued cooperation over cruelty. The Imperium did not see it that way. The Imperium saw alien creatures stealing human worlds, corrupting human populations, and expanding into territory that rightfully belonged to mankind. The response was inevitable. The Damocles Crusade. The Imperium assembled a crusade force and dispatched it to the Damocles Gulf, the region of space separating Tau territory from the main body of Imperial space. The force was substantial. Imperial Guard regiments, Imperial Navy squadrons, and Space Marine elements, including warriors from the Ultramarines chapter. By Imperial standards, it was not the largest crusade ever launched, but it was more than sufficient to deal with what the Imperium strategists believed was a minor Xenos power that had overstepped its boundaries. The Tau did not agree with that assessment. Commander Farsight was called upon to help coordinate the defense of the Empire during the Damocles Crusade. He was not the supreme commander, not yet. But his reputation from Arkunasha had made him one of the most prominent Firecast officers in the Empire, and his talents were needed now more than ever. The Damocles Crusade was Farsight's introduction to human warfare, and it was an education that changed him profoundly. The Imperium fought differently from the Orcs. The Orcs were predictable, driven by aggression and the desire for close combat. Humans were unpredictable. They used combined arms, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air power in ways that the Tau's existing tactical doctrines had not prepared for. Imperial Guard infantry were individually less dangerous than fire warriors, but they came in such staggering numbers that quality became irrelevant. Imperial tanks were crude by Tau standards, but they were heavily armored and they carried weapons that could shatter a crisis suit with a single shot. And the Space Marines were something that the Tau had no basis for understanding at all. The first time Farsight encountered Space Marines in combat, it nearly killed him. He was leading a battlesuit cadre in a counterattack against an Imperial beachhead when the Ultramarines deployed. They came down in drop pods, the ceramite shells slamming into the ground like orbital artillery. And the giants that emerged from the smoking craters were something out of a nightmare that the Tau had never imagined. Farsight later described the experience in private conversations with his closest advisors as the moment he realized that the galaxy was much larger and much more dangerous than anything the Tau Empire had prepared him for. The Tau had fought orcs, creatures of brute strength, and crude technology. They had fought minor Xenos species that posed local threats, but could be managed with standard tactics and superior firepower. Nothing in Farsight's experience, nothing in the Code of Fire, nothing in Commander Farsight's teachings had prepared him for an enemy that combined the physical power of an orc with the tactical sophistication of a Tau commander, wrapped in armor that pulse rifles could not reliably penetrate. Space Marines were unlike any enemy the Tau had previously fought. They were superhuman, genetically enhanced warriors in powered armor that made them functionally immune to pulse rifle fire. They were faster than they had any right to be, stronger than any biological creature should be, and they fought with a ferocity and tactical sophistication that put even the best trained Firecast veterans to shame. A single Space Marine could tear through a Tau fire team like a blade through cloth. Farsight fought against warriors of the Ultramarines chapter during the campaign. The accounts of his personal engagements during the Damocles Crusade are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. But what is consistent across all of them is that Farsight was deeply affected by the experience. He had never faced an enemy that combined such physical power with such tactical discipline. The Orcs had power but no discipline. The Tau had discipline but lacked the raw physical dominance that the Space Marines brought to every engagement. The Damocles Crusade tested the Tau Empire in ways it had never been tested before. Imperial forces pushed deep into Tau space, conquering worlds and destroying fleets. The Sept world of Dalth became the campaign's central battlefield. Dalith was a major Tau colony, a world of considerable economic and strategic importance, and the Imperial commanders recognized that its capture would cripple the Tau Empire's ability to sustain resistance in the sector. They landed in strength, deploying multiple Imperial Guard regiments supported by armored columns, artillery batteries, and orbital bombardment capabilities that reduced entire districts to rubble before the first soldiers set foot in them. The fighting on Dalith was unlike anything the Tau had experienced. The Imperium fought a campaign of grinding, attritional warfare that played to its strengths rather than the Tau's. The humans were willing to accept casualties at ratios that would have been considered catastrophic by any Tau standard. They advanced through pulse fire and drone strikes and battlesuit counterattacks, absorbing losses that would have broken the morale of any rational force. And they kept coming. The sheer weight of Imperial numbers, the apparently inexhaustible supply of soldiers and vehicles and ammunition was numbing. For every Imperial tank that the Tau destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every infantry company that was cut down, a fresh one was deployed. Farsight distinguished himself on Dalith with a series of mobile defensive actions that became the foundation of the Tau's entire anti-imperial tactical doctrine. He recognized early in the campaign that the Tau could not fight the Imperium on the Imperium's terms. Attrition warfare, the grinding exchange of casualties that the Imperial Guard excelled at, would destroy the Tau through sheer mathematics. The Tau did not have the population to replace losses at the rate the Imperium could. Every fire warrior who fell was a resource that the Empire could not easily replace. Every Imperial Guardsman who fell was replaced by 10 more, shipped in from worlds with populations in the billions. Farsight developed what he called the rolling defense, a tactical approach that used the Tau's superior mobility and sensor technology to maintain constant contact with the Imperial advance, while never allowing the humans to bring their full weight to bear. His forces would engage the Imperial columns at long range, pour fire into them from positions that the humans could not easily assault, and then withdraw before the Imperial counterattack could develop. The Imperials would advance into the vacated positions, set up their artillery, prepare their next push, and then discover that the Tau had already relocated to the next defensible position, where the process would repeat. It was exhausting for both sides, but it was far more costly for the Imperium. The Tau casualties were minimal because they never stayed in one place long enough to be pinned down and overwhelmed. The Imperial casualties were significant because they were constantly advancing into prepared positions, constantly exposing themselves to pulse fire and railgun strikes and drone-guided missiles while trying to close with an enemy that refused to stand and fight. The Battle of Dal'yth became a textbook example of how a technologically superior but numerically inferior force could resist a larger enemy through mobility, firepower, and the willingness to trade space for time. Farsight distinguished himself repeatedly during the campaign. He was creative, adaptive, and willing to take risks that other Tau commanders considered reckless. He developed new tactics for dealing with Space Marines, emphasizing concentrated firepower, coordinated drone strikes, and the use of battle suits in aggressive, mobile formations that could engage the superhuman warriors at close range without being destroyed. He pushed the boundaries of what crisis suits could do in combat, using jet-assisted movement to stay one step ahead of enemies who were faster and stronger on foot. One of the most significant engagements of the Damocles Crusade was the battle at Black Thunder Mesa, where Commander Bravestorm, one of Farsight's subordinates and a warrior of exceptional courage, fought a desperate action against Imperial armored forces. Bravestorm, piloting a crisis suit armed with the experimental Onega Gauntlet, a close combat weapon that could punch through the heaviest Imperial tank armor, waded into the Imperial armored column and destroyed vehicle after vehicle in hand-to-hand combat. It was the kind of engagement that Tau doctrine said should never happen. A Firecast warrior engaging in melee combat against armored vehicles, and it was devastatingly effective. Bravestorm paid for his heroism. His battle suit was critically damaged during the engagement, and Bravestorm himself was so badly wounded that he could never leave the suit again. He was entombed in life support systems, his ruined body sustained by the suit's medical apparatus, unable to live outside the machine but unable to die inside it. He became a living monument to the cost of the kind of warfare that Farsight believed was necessary. A warrior permanently fused with his weapons, fighting on not because he had a choice, but because stopping was no longer an option. The Damocles Crusade did not end in a decisive victory for either side. The Imperium pushed deep into Tau space, but the Tau fought back with enough skill and determination to make the campaign far more costly than the Imperial commanders had expected. And then, just as the Imperium was preparing to launch the final push that might have broken the Tau Empire entirely, something happened. The Tyranids arrived. Hive Fleet Behemoth emerged from the intergalactic void and struck the eastern fringe of the galaxy, heading straight for Ultramar, the home territory of the Ultramarines. The Imperium suddenly had a far more pressing concern than a minor Xenos empire on its periphery, and the Damocles Crusade was quietly called off. Imperial forces withdrew from Tau space, leaving behind worlds they had conquered and populations they had displaced, and redirected their attention to the Tyranid threat. The Tau declared victory. The Watercast announced that the greater good had prevailed, that the barbarian humans had been driven from Tau space by the superiority of Tau technology and Tau values. Celebrations were held. Medals were awarded. The Empire's propaganda machine presented the Damocles Crusade as a triumph. Farsight knew better. And more than that, Farsight had learned something about the humans that troubled him in ways that had nothing to do with military strategy. The Imperium soldiers were not the mindless barbarians that Tau propaganda described. The Imperial Guard troopers who fought on Dalith were crude by Tau standards, poorly equipped, badly led by comparison to Tau commanders, and thrown into combat with a callous disregard for their survival that would have been inconceivable in the Firecast. But they were brave. They were loyal to each other, if not always to their commanders. They fought with a dogged, stubborn courage that Farsight could not help but respect, even as his forces cut them down by the thousands. And the Space Marines were something else entirely. They were not just warriors. They were believers. They fought for something they called the Emperor, a being that Farsight understood to be their species' supreme leader, a figure of religious veneration who sat on a throne on their homeworld and had not spoken or moved in 10,000 years. The Space Marines fought and died for this silent, immobile figure with a devotion that was, by any rational standard, insane. And yet that devotion made them terrifying. An enemy who fights for a cause they believe in is always more dangerous than an enemy who fights for survival or territory or resources. A true believer cannot be bought, cannot be intimidated, cannot be reasoned with. They can only be killed. And even then, they die believing. Farsight filed this observation alongside the others. The galaxy was more complicated than the Ethereals had led him to believe. The enemies of the greater good were not simply obstacles to be overcome. They were civilizations with their own beliefs, their own strengths, their own reasons for fighting. Understanding them was as important as defeating them. The Ethereals did not agree. He had studied the Imperial withdrawal with the same analytical precision he applied to everything else, and he saw what the Ethereals and the Watercast either did not see or chose not to acknowledge. The Imperium had not been defeated. The Imperium had left. There was a difference. And it was a difference that mattered enormously. The humans had withdrawn because something worse had arrived, not because the Tau had beaten them. If the Tyranids had not appeared, if the Imperium had committed its full resources to the Damocles Crusade, the Tau would have lost. Not might have lost. Would have lost. This realization haunted Farsight. It suggested that the Tau Empire was not as powerful as it believed itself to be. That the greater good, for all its philosophical elegance, did not make the Tau immune to the brute mathematics of galactic warfare. That there were forces in the galaxy so vast and so powerful that all the technology and discipline and tactical brilliance in the Tau arsenal would not be enough to stop them. The Ethereals did not want to hear this. They wanted celebration, not analysis. They wanted confidence, not caution. And they wanted Commander Farsight to play his role in the narrative they were constructing. The narrative of Tau invincibility. The narrative that said the greater good would always triumph because it was right. Farsight played his role. He stood in the ranks of victorious commanders and accepted the honors that the Ethereals bestowed. He sat through the ceremonies. He said the words that were expected of him. He listened to the water caste's proclamations of triumph and did not contradict them. He watched the celebrations and the parades and the public rituals of self-congratulation and kept his analysis to himself. But he was thinking. He was always thinking. He thought about the Imperial Guardsmen who had charged into pulse fire without hesitation, dying in droves for a cause they believed in with their last breath. He thought about the Space Marines who had fought with a ferocity and discipline that matched or exceeded anything the Firecaste could produce. He thought about the Imperial Navy's ships, crude and brutal by Tau standards, but built in such staggering quantities that their individual inferiority was irrelevant. He thought about an empire that spanned 1,000,000 worlds and counted its soldiers in numbers that the Tau literally did not have words for. And he thought about the Tyranids, the creatures that had drawn the Imperium away, and he wondered what kind of threat could make an empire that powerful simply abandon a war it was winning. There was something else that troubled Farsight in the aftermath of the Damocles Crusade. Something more personal and more disturbing than the strategic implications of the Imperial withdrawal. There was also the matter of the Puritide neurochips, and this was a horror of a different kind. The Puritide neurochips. Commander Puritide, the legendary teacher who had trained Farsight and Shadowsun and Kais, was dying. Tau lifespans are short, and even the greatest of the Firecaste cannot outrun the biological clock. The Ethereals, recognizing that Puritide's knowledge was irreplaceable, had ordered the Earthcaste to develop a method of preserving his tactical genius beyond the span of his mortal life. The result was the Puritide Engram neurochip, a device that recorded Puritide's neural patterns and could be implanted into the brains of other Tau commanders, giving them access to his tactical instincts and decision-making patterns. It was, on the surface, a remarkable achievement, a way to ensure that the greatest military mind in Tau history would continue to serve the greater good even after its original vessel had perished. Farsight was horrified. Not by the technology itself, although that was troubling enough, but by what happened when the neurochips were removed. The commanders who had been fitted with the chips, who had fought with Puritide's ghost riding in their heads, guiding their decisions, whispering tactical options into the quiet spaces of their minds, were left brain dead when the chips were extracted. The process of implantation was irreversible. The chip did not add to the commander's abilities. It replaced them, and when it was taken away, there was nothing left. The first Tau to receive a Puritide chip was Commander Shavastos, one of Farsight's most trusted subordinates. Shavastos had accepted the implantation willingly, eager to serve the greater good in any way he could. But when the prototype chip began to degrade, when its systems started to fail and the neural patterns started to corrupt, the Ethereals ordered the chip removed and a new version installed. Farsight intervened. He could not save Shavastos from the chip, which was already integrated too deeply into the commander's neural architecture to be safely extracted. But he could prevent the Ethereals from treating his friend as a piece of disposable hardware, a testbed for experimental technology that would be discarded when it malfunctioned. Farsight had Shavastos placed in a stasis pod, suspended between life and death, until a solution could be found. It was a small act of defiance, a crack in the wall of absolute obedience that the Tau Empire demanded of its servants. Farsight had disobeyed an implicit ethereal directive, not dramatically, not publicly, but he had placed the life of a single commander above the experimental programs of the ruling caste. The Ethereals noticed. They always noticed. But they did not act. Not yet. Farsight was too popular, too successful, too valuable. The Empire needed him. And the Ethereals had plans for him. Plans that would take him far from the heart of Tau space, far from the centers of power where his growing independence might become a problem. The Ethereals had also decided that Puritide's most promising students should be preserved through cryogenic stasis, frozen and stored for future campaigns that would occur beyond the natural lifespan of the Tau. Puritide's 3 top protégés, Farsight, Shadowson and Kais, were selected for this program. They would take turns in rotation, one awake and on active duty while the others slept in frozen chambers, their aging suspended, their consciousness held in dreamless cold until the Empire needed them again. Farsight served his rotation. He went into the cold and came out again, and the galaxy had changed while he slept. Years had passed. People he knew had aged and died while he remained the same age he had been when he went under. The experience of stepping out of a stasis pod and discovering that the world had moved on without you was disorienting in a way that Farsight had not anticipated. It was a small taste of the temporal dislocation that the Dawnblade would eventually impose on him, though he did not know that yet. When Farsight emerged from his stasis rotation, the Ethereals had a new mission for him. A grand expedition to the worlds beyond the Damocles Gulf, to reclaim the colonies that had been lost during the Crusade, and to push the boundaries of Tau civilization further than they had ever extended before. The Farsight expedition. It would be the mission that made him a legend, and it would be the mission that made him a traitor. The Farsight expedition was conceived officially as an act of hope. The Damocles Crusade had shaken the Tau Empire in ways that the Ethereals did not want to acknowledge publicly, but could not entirely ignore privately. Morale was fragile. The Empire's population, accustomed to decades of steady expansion and easy victories, had been confronted for the first time with an enemy that could match them, that could push them back. That could make the greater good feel less like an inevitable destiny and more like a fragile dream. Aun Wei, the Ethereal Supreme, was convinced by the council of the ambitious Ethereal Aunvar to authorize a grand expedition to rekindle the spirit of the people. The expedition would reclaim the colonies that had been lost during the Damocles Crusade, establish new settlements beyond the Damocles Gulf, and demonstrate to the galaxy that the Tau Empire was not retreating but advancing. It would be a statement of intent, a declaration that the setback of the Crusade was temporary, and that the greater good would continue its march across the stars. Commander Farsight was chosen to lead it. The choice was not accidental. Farsight was the Empire's most celebrated military hero, the savior of Arkunasha, the defender of Dalith. His name carried weight with the Firecast and with the civilian population alike. He was the perfect figurehead for a campaign designed to project strength and confidence. He was also, from the Ethereals' perspective, becoming a problem. Farsight's growing independence, his questioning of ethereal authority, his intervention on behalf of Shavastos, his uncomfortable questions about the true outcome of the Damocles Crusade. All of it suggested a commander who was drifting away from the absolute obedience that the ethereal caste required, sending him to the far edge of Tau space. Far from the political centers where his influence could grow was a convenient solution. If he succeeded, the Empire would benefit from his victories. If he failed, or if something happened to him in the dangerous territories beyond the Gulf, the problem would solve itself. The expedition fleet was assembled at Dalith, the same sept world where Farsight had fought the Imperium during the Damocles Crusade. The irony was not lost on him. He was being sent to reclaim the territory that the Imperium had contested, to push beyond the boundaries that the human invasion had temporarily drawn, and to do it with the same warriors who had fought and bled and watched their friends die in the defense of these very worlds. Many of those warriors volunteered precisely because Farsight was leading the expedition. His name carried a weight in the firecast that transcended rank or assignment. Tau, who had served under him on Arkunasha or Dalith, requested transfer to the expedition force. Young fire warriors who had grown up hearing stories of Oshova's exploits competed for spots in the expeditionary cadres. The expedition became, in a sense, the Farsight army, a military force that was loyal to its commander in a way that went beyond the standard chain of command and into something more personal, more dangerous. The Ethereals noticed this too. The intensity of the Firecast's devotion to Farsight was, from the Ethereals' perspective, a symptom of the problem they were trying to solve by sending him away. A commander who inspired personal loyalty on this scale was a commander who could, if he chose, redirect that loyalty away from the Empire and toward himself. The Ethereals did not believe Farsight would do this, not consciously. But they understood, with the same instinctive political awareness that had kept them in power for 6,000 years, that the potential was there, and that potential was dangerous. Farsight accepted the command without hesitation. He may have suspected the Ethereals' motives. He may not have cared. What mattered to him was the mission, the chance to push beyond the known boundaries of Tau's space, to face new enemies in new environments, to test himself and his warriors against challenges that no Tau had ever confronted. The expedition was enormous. Multiple fleets, thousands of warriors, dozens of battlesuits, a full complement of ethereal advisors, and the logistical support needed to sustain a military campaign across unexplored space. Farsight organized it with his characteristic precision, selecting his best commanders, equipping his forces with the latest weapons and technology, and planning contingencies for every scenario his tactical mind could envision. There were things he could not envision, things that no Tau had ever experienced, things that no amount of planning could prepare him for. But he did not know that yet. The expedition's first objectives were straightforward: reclaim the lost colonies, establish secure supply lines, push back the threats that had moved into the power vacuum left by the Damocles Crusade. This Farsight did with efficiency that surprised no one who knew him. The expedition crossed the Damocles Gulf, the vast stretch of relatively empty space that separated the Tau Empire from the territories beyond. The crossing itself was an achievement. The Gulf was not heavily traveled. Tau's stellar cartography of the regions beyond was incomplete, based on long-range surveys and the fragmentary intelligence gathered during the Damocles Crusade. Farsight's navigators had to chart their course through poorly mapped space, avoiding gravitational anomalies, stellar radiation zones, and the debris fields left by ancient conflicts that no one alive remembered. The journey gave Farsight time to think, and what he thought about increasingly was the nature of the universe beyond the Empire's borders. The Tau Empire occupied a tiny fraction of the galaxy. Even the Imperium, vast as it was, controlled only a portion of the Milky Way's habitable worlds. What lay in the spaces between civilizations? What had existed before the current powers arose? What threats were lurking in the darkness, beyond the range of Tau sensors and Tau understanding, waiting for the moment when the Tau pushed far enough into the unknown to stumble across them? These were not comfortable questions. They were not questions that the greater good, as the Ethereals defined it, was designed to address. The greater good was an inward-looking philosophy, concerned with the welfare and advancement of the Tau species and its allies. It did not account for the possibility that the galaxy contained horrors so vast and so ancient that no species' welfare could be guaranteed against them. Colony after colony was brought back into the fold. Imperial deserters and abandoned garrison forces were eliminated. Orc warbands that had taken advantage of the chaos were hunted down and destroyed. But Farsight did not stop at the old boundaries. The Ethereals had given him a mandate to explore beyond known space. And he took that mandate further than they had intended. He pushed deeper into the territories beyond the Gulf, cataloguing new worlds, assessing new threats, and building a network of outposts and supply depots that extended the Tau Empire's reach further than it had ever gone before. It was during this phase of the expedition that Farsight encountered the Orcs again. Not a raiding party, not a minor warband, a full Orc empire under the warlord Grog Iron Teeth, a conglomeration of tribes that had built something resembling a civilization in the space beyond the Damocles Gulf. This was an Orc presence far larger and more organized than anything the Tau had dealt with before, and it sat directly across the path of the expedition's advance. Farsight should have reported back to the Ethereal Council and awaited instructions. That was doctrine. That was protocol. That was what a loyal commander who believed in the chain of command was supposed to do. Farsight did not wait. He attacked. The decision was characteristically Farsight. The Ethereal advisors counseled caution. They wanted surveys, assessments, diplomatic evaluation through the watercast. They wanted to determine whether the Orc presence could be contained, managed, worked around. Farsight looked at the intelligence reports, ran the scenarios through his mind, and concluded that an Orc empire left to grow and consolidate would eventually become a threat that the Tau could not contain. Better to strike now, while the Greenskins were still divided into competing factions, than to wait until a strong enough warlord united them into a force that could overwhelm the expedition. It was the right military decision. The Ethereals recognized this, grudgingly, but it was also a decision made without their approval, and that precedent disturbed them more than the Orcs did. The campaign against the Orc Empire beyond the Gulf became a war of attrition, a grinding, brutal conflict that stretched over months and consumed resources at a rate that alarmed the Ethereal advisors attached to the expedition. The Ethereals wanted Farsight to pull back, to consolidate his gains, to fortify the territory he had already claimed, and wait for reinforcements. Farsight refused. The Orcs were running, and a running Orc was an Orc that would regroup, rebuild, and come back stronger. Better to finish them now, whatever the cost, than to give them time to recover. This was the first open conflict between Farsight and his Ethereal advisors. It was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no shouting, no threats, no dramatic break. It was a slow, steady accumulation of disagreements. a growing tension between a commander who believed that military necessity should dictate military decisions, and advisors who believed that the broader interests of the greater good, as defined by the Ethereal Council, should take precedence over the judgment of any individual commander. Farsight's approach to dealing with billions of orcs was characteristically inventive. He did not try to destroy them through direct confrontation, which would have been impossibly expensive in lives and material. Instead, he adopted a strategy of decapitation, spending a year targeting the biggest and most powerful orc leaders with long-range strikes, precision battlesuit assaults, and covert operations designed to kill the war bosses without engaging their armies. Without their leaders, the orc tribes fell to infighting. The orc social structure, built entirely on the authority of the biggest and meanest, collapsed every time a war boss was eliminated. The tribes fragmented, turned on each other, and spent their energy fighting for internal dominance rather than opposing the Tau advance. Farsight then swept through the weakened and divided orc territories, mopping up the scattered remnants with methodical efficiency. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. And it put Farsight further and further from the Empire's control with each passing month. The Orc campaign also deepened Farsight's conviction that close combat was an essential part of Tau warfare. In the close quarters fighting that was sometimes unavoidable when clearing Orc-held settlements and underground warrens, Farsight's battlesuits were forced into melee range more often than the standard doctrine anticipated. He developed new close combat techniques for crisis suits, adapting the suit's manipulators and auxiliary systems for hand-to-hand fighting, and he trained his pilots in movement patterns and engagement protocols that the fire academies back in the Empire had never taught. The results were impressive. Farsight's close combat-trained battlesuit teams could engage orc warriors at melee range and win, something that conventional Tau doctrine said was impossible. The key was speed, not strength. The crisis suit's jet-assisted movement allowed them to engage, strike, and disengage before the orcs could bring their superior melee prowess to bear. It was not about standing toe-to-toe with a greenskin and trading blows. It was about hitting first, hitting hard, and being somewhere else before the orc could hit back. This approach was heretical by the standards of the Firecast. It contradicted decades of doctrine that said Tau should never willingly engage in close combat, and it worked so well that Farsight's forces were clearing orc positions in a fraction of the time that a conventional Tau operation would have required. The Ethereals assigned to the expedition grew increasingly uneasy. They sent reports back to the Ethereal Council. They expressed concerns about Farsight's willingness to operate independently, his tendency to make strategic decisions without consulting them, his habit of treating ethereal advice as suggestions rather than directives. The Council received these reports and filed them away. Farsight was winning. As long as he was winning, they could tolerate a degree of independence. But the campaign against the orcs was not the event that would change everything. The event that would change everything was waiting on a dead world at the edge of the expedition's advance. A world that the Tau had never visited. A world that no living thing had called home for centuries. A world called Arthas Moloch. The expedition arrived at Arthas Moloch during the final stages of the Orc campaign. The world was a desolation, a barren planet of ancient ruins and strange, faceless statues that predated the Imperium of Man. The ruins were old in a way that the Tau, with their 6,000-year history, could barely comprehend. They were old in a way that suggested civilizations that had risen and fallen while the Tau were still hunting with spears on their homeworld. The planet was empty. No life signs, no energy signatures, no evidence of habitation for centuries. At some point in the past, the world had been purged, its population exterminated by forces unknown. The ruins bore the marks of violence. Dark brown stains on the walls, shadows burned into stone that looked like the silhouettes of people caught in the moment of their death. There was a wrongness to the place, a sense of unease that even the Tau, with their minimal psychic sensitivity, could feel as a prickling at the base of their spines. The ethereal advisors were uncomfortable. They wanted to catalogue the world from orbit and move on. There was nothing here that served the greater good. Nothing here that was worth the risk of landing on a planet that felt in some indefinable way like a wound that had not healed. Farsight wanted to investigate. The ruins suggested a level of technological sophistication that might be useful to the Empire. The faceless statues suggested a culture that the Earthcast would want to study. And something about the planet pulled at Farsight's attention in a way he could not articulate. A sense that this place held answers to questions he had not yet learnt to ask. They landed. Farsight led the first deployment personally. Descending from orbit in his crisis suit at the head of a reconnaissance cadre, touching down in the shadow of the faceless statues while his drones fanned out through the ruins. The world felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, not hostile in the way that a war zone or a predator-infested jungle felt hostile. Wrong in a way that was harder to articulate. The air tasted of ozone and something older. The light fell at strange angles as though the ruins were bending it, or as though the light itself was reluctant to touch the stone. Sound carried differently. Echoes returning from distances that should have been too far, or not returning at all from walls that were clearly close enough to bounce them back. The Tau are not a psychically sensitive species. They do not feel the warp the way humans do not sense the presence of demonic entities or the subtle wrongness of a place where the barrier between reality and the immaterium has worn thin. But even the Tau felt something on Arthas Moloch. A prickling, a discomfort, a nagging sense that the eyes of the faceless statues, despite having no eyes, were watching. And everything changed. The ruins of Arthas Moloch were arranged around a central structure, a raised dais of dark stone covered in symbols that the Tau's translation algorithms could not decipher. The symbols were not text in any conventional sense. They were sigils, abstract patterns that seemed to shift at the edge of perception, designs that the eye could follow but the mind could not hold. The Earthcast researchers found them fascinating. The Ethereals found them disturbing. Farsight found them familiar in a way that made no sense, as though he had seen them before in a dream he could not remember. The dais was surrounded by statues, dozens of them, humanoid figures with their faces deliberately removed. Smooth blanks where features should have been. They stood in concentric circles around the central platform, their empty faces turned inward, their hands raised in gestures that might have been worship or warning. Around their necks, carved into the stone, were medallions bearing a distinctive hexagrammic symbol, a six-pointed star within a circle that the Tau had no reference for. Farsight's expedition began to explore the ruins. Earthcast engineers documented the structure. Firecast warriors secured the perimeter. Drones mapped the surrounding terrain in expanding circles, finding more ruins, more statues, more of the strange hexagrammic symbols repeated on walls and doorways, and scattered fragments of what might once have been technology. And then, blood was spilled. The accounts of what exactly happened vary. In some tellings, an Orc war party that had been pursuing the Tau expedition found them at the ruins and attacked. And the blood of the fallen triggered something in the ancient dyes. In others, a Tau warrior was injured during the exploration, and their blood fell on the stone of the central platform, activating a mechanism that the builders of this place had laid down millennia ago. The details differ, but the result is the same. What happened next is difficult to describe in terms that the Tau language was designed to accommodate. Because the Tau language was built by a species that had never needed words for the concepts it was about to encounter. The air tore open. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The fabric of reality split apart above the dyes, and from the wound poured things that the Tau had no name for, no concept for, no frame of reference for understanding. Daemons. The Tau do not have a word for daemons. They do not have a concept of the warp in the way that the Imperium understands it. The Tau are, as a species, almost entirely psychically null. They have no psychers, no sorcerers, no connection to the immaterium beyond the faintest whisper of presence that any living creature generates. This psychic blindness has been, in many ways, the Tau's greatest protection. The Chaos Gods feed on psychic energy, and a species that generates almost none is, from their perspective, barely worth noticing. But the Chaos Gods are not limited to psychic predation. Their daemons are real. Physical entities that can manifest in real space under the right conditions. And the conditions on Arthas Moloch, the ancient ritual site, the blood on the stone, the accumulated psychic residue of whatever nightmares had been enacted here over millennia, were apparently right enough. The creatures that poured through the breach were nightmarish. They were things of claw and fang and impossible anatomy, bodies that shifted and flowed as though the physical forms they wore were costumes rather than structures. They burned with a heat that was not thermal, an inner fire that scorched the spirit rather than the flesh. They screamed with voices that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the mind. Sounds that carried emotions rather than meaning, waves of rage and hunger and malice that hit the Tau defenders like physical blows. The Tau had never seen anything like this. Their weapons were designed to destroy physical targets, enemies made of flesh and bone and metal. These creatures were not entirely physical. Pulse fire struck them and seemed to pass through, or struck them and inflicted wounds that healed before the next volley could land. Some of them could be killed, but the effort required was disproportionate to the creature's apparent size and durability. It was as though the Tau's weapons were fighting in a medium they were not designed for, like trying to cut water with a blade. The Ethereals died first. This is one of the most significant facts of the Arthas Moloch incident, and one that has been endlessly debated in the centuries since. Every Ethereal assigned to the Farsight expedition was killed during the battle at the ruins. Every single one. The battle was a chaos of pulse fire and screaming and the wet, meaty sounds of creatures that should not exist tearing through Tau warriors, who had never been trained to fight anything like them. The Tau's standard combat formations, designed for ranged engagement against physical enemies, broke down almost immediately. Fire teams that formed clean firing lines found that their pulse rifles were barely effective against creatures that healed from wounds faster than new ones could be inflicted. Battlesuit pilots who engaged the daemons at range discovered that the creatures could close to melee distance in heartbeats, crossing open ground with a speed that defied their apparently clumsy, malformed bodies. The Ethereals ordered a retreat. It was, from a pure tactical standpoint, the correct call. The Tau were being overwhelmed by an enemy they did not understand and could not effectively engage. Retreat, regroup, and return with better intelligence and better weapons was the standard Tau response to an engagement gone wrong, but the retreat order came too late, and the Ethereals paid the price for their delayed judgment. Some accounts suggest that the daemons targeted the Ethereals deliberately, drawn to them by some quality that the Ethereals possessed and the other Tau did not. Others suggest that the Ethereals died in the general chaos of the battle, victims of circumstance rather than targeting. A few darker interpretations have suggested that the Ethereals' deaths were not entirely accidental, that Farsight or his commanders allowed the Ethereals to die or even facilitated their deaths. Because the Ethereals' influence was the last chain binding Farsight to the Empire's control. There is no proof of this. There likely never will be. What is certain is that when the last Ethereal fell, something changed in Farsight and in the Tau warriors under his command. The compulsion was gone. For the first time in their lives, the Tau of the Farsight expedition were making decisions without the subtle, ever-present influence of an Ethereal's will. For the first time, their obedience was not being shaped by the biochemical, or psychic, or simply charismatic force that the Ethereals exerted over their subordinates. They were thinking for themselves, truly for themselves, and the experience was both terrifying and exhilarating. But there was no time to process this revelation. The daemons were still coming, and Farsight's forces were being overwhelmed. In the chaos of the battle, with his warriors dying around him and the creatures pouring through the breach in reality with no sign of stopping, Farsight was driven back to the central days. His battlesuit's weapons were running dry. His shield generator was failing. He had taken damage, serious damage, and his suit's medical systems were struggling to keep him conscious. And there, on the dais, half buried in the rubble of a fallen statue, he saw it. A sword. It was not a Tau weapon. It was not a human weapon. It was something older than either species, something forged by hands that had never been identified, from materials that the Earthcast would later declare completely beyond their understanding. It was beautiful in a way that was almost offensive, a blade of unknown alloys that caught the light and refracted it into patterns that seemed to move, to breathe, to pulse with an energy that had no source. Farsight, dying, his suit failing, his weapons empty, ripped the sword from the statue's grip and swung it at the horror towering above him. A thing of brass and blood and impossible fury that the Imperium would have recognized as a bloodthirster of Khorne. The creature came apart, not in the slow, reluctant way that pulse fire had damaged them. The sword cut through the daemon as though its unnatural flesh was smoke, and where the blade passed, the creature ceased to exist. Not killed, unmade, annihilated in a way that was fundamentally different from physical destruction. The Dawn blade was impossibly light for a weapon of its size. It felt less like holding a sword and more like holding an extension of his own arm. as though the blade had been waiting for this moment, waiting for a hand to take it up. And now that the connection was made, the weapon and the wielder were one thing. Farsight felt the sword hum in his hands, felt it resonate with something that was not quite vibration and not quite sound, and he understood, in a way that was purely instinctive and had nothing to do with rational analysis, that this weapon was made for this. Made for killing things that should not exist, made for cutting through reality and unreality alike. He waded into the daemon horde with the sword in his battlesuit's manipulator claw, and he carved a path of destruction that the surviving witnesses would describe, in the quiet years that followed, with a reverence that bordered on religious awe. The daemons recoiled from the blade. They screamed in a register that suggested something closer to fear than rage. And they broke, retreating back through the breach in reality, pulling the wound shut behind them as though afraid that Farsight would follow them through. The battle was over. The breach was sealed. The daemons were gone. And Commander Farsight stood in the ruins of Arthas Moloch, holding a weapon that pulsed with unknown energy, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen Ethereals. And he realized two things simultaneously. The first was that the universe contained horrors that the Tau Empire had no knowledge of, threats that its philosophy and its technology were utterly unprepared to face. The Ethereals had never mentioned creatures like this. The official histories contained no reference to entities that could tear reality apart and pour through the gaps. The Tau's entire understanding of the galaxy, the understanding that the Ethereals had curated and controlled and presented as complete, was missing a chapter so vast and so terrifying that its omission could only be deliberate. The Ethereals had known. They had to have known. And they had chosen not to tell their people. The second realization was simpler, and in its way more profound. Farsight looked at the hexagrammic symbols carved into the medallions around the statues' necks. He remembered where he had seen that symbol before. During the Damocles Crusade, during his encounters with Imperial forces, he had seen human soldiers wearing similar symbols. Symbols of protection. Wards against the very creatures he had just fought. The humans knew about these things. They had known for thousands of years. They had developed symbols and rituals and weapons expressly designed to combat entities from whatever dimension those creatures came from. And the Tau knew nothing. The greater good, the philosophy that was supposed to encompass all knowledge, all wisdom, all truth necessary for the advancement of the Tau species, had left its people blind to the existence of an enemy that could destroy them utterly. Farsight picked up one of the hexagrammic medallions from a fallen statue. He turned it over in his battlesuit's manipulator. He thought about everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, everything the Ethereals had told him about the nature of the universe and the Tau's place in it. And he made a decision. He was not going back. The realization crystallized slowly over the hours and days that followed the battle, as Farsight sat in his damaged battlesuit amid the ruins and thought through the implications of what he had witnessed. He was not prone to rash decisions. He was a tactician, a planner, someone who evaluated options and calculated outcomes before committing to a course of action. The decision to break with the Tau Empire, to sever the ties that had defined his entire existence, to reject the authority of the Ethereals and everything they represented, was not made in a moment of passion or fury. It was made through cold, relentless logic. The Ethereals had known about these creatures. The hexagrammic symbols on the statues, the ones that had seemed to repel the daemons, were similar to symbols that humans wore, that Farsight had observed on Imperial soldiers and their equipment during the Damocles Crusade. The humans had been fighting these entities for millennia. They had an entire institutional structure: the Inquisition, the Grey Knights, the Ecclesiarchy's rituals and wards, dedicated to combating them. The existence of these creatures was well known to the older species of the galaxy. The Tau knew nothing, and the Ethereals, who controlled the flow of information through Tau society, who curated knowledge and decided what their people were and were not allowed to know, had kept this information from them. Whether out of fear that the knowledge would destabilize Tau society, or out of a calculated decision that ignorance would make the Tau easier to control, or for reasons that Farsight could not even guess at, the Ethereals had left their people blind. Blind to threats that could destroy them. Farsight could not go back to that. He could not return to a civilization that built its safety on ignorance and called it wisdom. He could not serve rulers who hid the truth from their people and called it protection. Not to the Empire. Not to the Ethereals. Not to the lies. The Ethereals who had accompanied the expedition were dead. The chain of command that connected Farsight to the Ethereal Council was severed. He was, for the first time in his life, completely free. Free to act on his own judgment. Free to protect his people in the way he believed was necessary. Free to acknowledge the truth that the Ethereals had hidden, and to prepare for the threats that the greater good, as the Ethereals defined it, had pretended did not exist. Farsight gathered his surviving forces. He told them what he had learned. He told them about the creatures, about the Ethereals' silence, about the hexagrammic symbols and what they implied. He gave them a choice: return to the Empire and submit to the authority of the Ethereal Council, which would certainly suppress everything they had witnessed and punish anyone who spoke of it, or follow him into the unknown, beyond the reach of the Ethereals, beyond the borders of the Tau Empire, into a future that was uncertain but honest. They followed him. It was not unanimous. Some warriors, particularly those who had been most deeply affected by the Ethereals' influence, could not accept the break. They had spent their entire lives obeying, believing, following. The sudden absence of that guiding presence left them adrift, confused, unable to make decisions that they had never been required to make for themselves. These Tau asked to return to the Empire, and Farsight let them go. He did not punish them. He did not call them cowards or traitors. He understood that the choice he was asking them to make, the choice to reject everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, everything that had given their lives structure and meaning, was not a choice that everyone could make. But many could. Many looked at what the Ethereals had hidden from them, at the creatures from beyond reality that had killed their friends while the Ethereals kept silent about their existence. And they felt something that the ethereal influence had always suppressed: anger. Not the controlled, purposeful anger of a warrior in combat, but the deep, cold anger of someone who has been lied to by the people they trusted most. Not all of them, but enough. More than enough. The departure from Arthas Moloch was not a dramatic flight. It was an organized, methodical withdrawal, planned with the same tactical precision that Farsight applied to everything. He secured the Dawnblade and the hexagrammic medallions. He recovered what data the Earthcast had gathered from the ruins. He documented the Daemon incursion in as much detail as his people's limited understanding allowed. He made sure that whatever they had learned on this dead world was preserved, not destroyed or suppressed. Then he turned his fleet away from the Tau Empire, away from the Ethereal Council, away from the civilization that had raised him and trained him and made him everything he was, and he headed deeper into the unknown. Behind him, across the vast emptiness of the Damocles Gulf, the Ethereal Council waited for reports that would never come. The Farsight enclaves were not founded with a declaration or a ceremony. There was no manifesto, no formal secession, no document of grievances sent to the Ethereal Council listing the reasons for the break. Farsight simply stopped responding to communications from the Empire, stopped following orders from the Ethereal Council, and started building something new in the territories beyond the Damocles Gulf. The worlds he had claimed during the expedition, the outposts and colonies and supply depots that he had established in the push beyond known space, became the nucleus of an independent Tau civilization. Farsight fortified them. He organized their populations. He established governance structures and supply chains and military command hierarchies, all of it modeled on the Tau Empire's systems, but with one critical difference. There were no Ethereals. The Farsight enclaves operate without the ruling caste. This is, from the perspective of mainstream Tau society, the most radical and disturbing aspect of Farsight's rebellion. The Ethereals are not merely administrators in the Tau Empire. They are the foundation on which everything else rests. They are the unifying force that holds the castes together, the voice of the greater good, the living embodiment of the collective will that gives Tau civilization its purpose and direction. Removing the Ethereals from Tau society is like removing the spine from a body. According to every theory of Tau governance, every model of Tau social structure, every assumption that the Tau have about their own nature, a Tau civilization without Ethereals should not be able to function. The enclaves function. They function because Farsight replaced ethereal authority with something else: shared purpose, earned loyalty, and the unifying experience of having survived something together that no one else in the Tau Empire could understand. The warriors and workers and scientists who followed Farsight into exile had all witnessed the events on Arthas Moloch. They had all seen the daemons. They had all felt the absence of the Ethereals, and discovered that they could still think, still choose, still serve the greater good, without a guiding hand telling them what the greater good demanded. This discovery was transformative. Tau, who had spent their entire lives under the subtle influence of ethereal authority, found that they could make their own decisions, form their own judgments, and commit to their own understanding of the greater good, without the compulsion that had always shaped their behavior. Some found this liberating. Others found it terrifying. A few found it so disorienting that they could not adapt, and these individuals were the ones most likely to eventually leave the enclaves and attempt to return to the Empire. But most stayed. Most found that the freedom to choose their own path, to define their own version of the greater good, was not the catastrophe that ethereal doctrine had always implied. The Tau of the enclaves were not less cooperative, not less devoted to the collective, not less willing to sacrifice for the common good. They were simply making those choices for themselves rather than having them made for them. Farsight governed the enclaves not as a dictator, but as a first among equals. He held military authority because he was the most qualified commander, and he made strategic decisions because his tactical genius was acknowledged by everyone who served under him. But he did not demand obedience. He earned it. He explained his reasoning, shared his information, and trusted his people to understand the logic behind his decisions. When they disagreed, he listened. When they had better ideas, he adopted them. He was, in his own way, more democratic than the Ethereals had ever been, because his authority was based on merit and trust, rather than on an innate, possibly biochemical ability to compel compliance. The caste system remained in the enclaves, but it became more flexible. The rigid separation between castes that characterized the main empire was relaxed in the enclaves, not because Farsight deliberately dismantled it, but because the practical demands of building a new civilization with limited resources required a degree of cross-caste cooperation that would have been unthinkable in the empire. Earth caste engineers worked alongside fire caste warriors. Water caste administrators trained in basic combat. Air caste pilots maintained their own ships when dedicated maintenance crews were not available. The early years of the enclaves were the hardest. Supply chains that had connected the expedition to the main empire's industrial base were severed. Replacement parts, ammunition, new equipment, all of it had to be produced locally, with the limited manufacturing capacity that the expedition's Earth caste could establish on frontier worlds never designed for large-scale industrial production. Oveza was instrumental during this period. The Earth caste genius threw himself into the challenge of building an industrial base from almost nothing, designing compact manufacturing facilities, developing new alloys from locally available materials, and improvising solutions to problems that the Empire's well-stocked factories would have solved with a requisition form. Under Ovesa's direction, the Enclave's Earth caste achieved feats of engineering that the main Empire would not have believed possible, building functional battlesuit production lines in converted cargo holds, manufacturing pulse rifle power cells from refined minerals extracted from asteroid mining operations, and maintaining the expedition's fleet of warships with repair techniques that would have horrified the Empire's standardized maintenance protocols, but kept the ships flying. The water caste, deprived of their traditional role as the Empire's diplomats, adapted to become the Enclave's internal administrators. They managed resource allocation, resolved disputes between settlements, coordinated supply distribution, and handled the complex logistics of keeping a multi-world civilization functioning without the infrastructure that the main empire took for granted. It was unglamorous work, far removed from the water caste's self-image as silver-tongued negotiators of interstellar treaties, but it was essential, and they did it with the same dedication that defined every caste in the enclaves. The air caste maintained the fleet and the interstellar transit routes that connected the enclave worlds. Without the Empire's vast network of space stations and orbital facilities, the air caste had to improvise, establishing refueling depots and maintenance facilities at strategically positioned asteroids and moons, creating a logistics network that was fragile by Empire standards, but functional enough to keep the enclaves connected. The result was a society that was, in many ways, more resilient and more adaptable than the empire it had left behind. The enclaves were smaller, poorer, less technologically advanced, and more militarily vulnerable than the Tau Empire. But they were also more cohesive, more innovative, and more honest about the threats they face. In the enclaves, the existence of the warp creatures was not a forbidden secret. It was acknowledged, studied, and prepared for. The hexagrammic symbols that Farsight had found on Arthas Moloch were analyzed by Earthcast researchers and reproduced on Enclave equipment as protective wards. The Enclaves did not fully understand what the symbols did or how they worked, but they knew from direct experience that the symbols offered some degree of protection against the creatures from beyond reality. And that was enough. The Tau Empire's response to the founding of the Enclaves was one of outrage, confusion, and carefully managed silence. Outrage because Farsight had done the unthinkable. He had rejected ethereal authority, the bedrock principle of Tau civilization, and had demonstrated that Tau society could function without it. This was not merely a military defection. It was an existential challenge to the legitimacy of the ruling caste. If other Tau learned that the Enclaves were thriving without Ethereals, if the idea spread that the Ethereals were not indispensable, the consequences for the Empire's power structure could be catastrophic. Confusion because the Ethereal Council could not agree on how to respond. Some Ethereals advocated for military action, a punitive expedition to crush the Enclaves and bring the traitors back under control. Others argued that a military campaign against the Enclaves would be prohibitively expensive, would divert resources from the Empire's ongoing expansion, and might fail, which would be an even greater humiliation than allowing the Enclaves to exist. Still others, a smaller and more pragmatic faction, suggested that the Enclaves might actually serve the Empire's interests as a buffer state on the far side of the Gulf, absorbing threats that would otherwise reach the Empire's own borders. In the end, the Ethereal Council chose the third option, but wrapped it in the language of the first. Officially, Commander Farsight was declared a traitor and a renegade. Communications between the Empire and the Enclaves were forbidden. Farsight's name was erased from official histories. His statues were torn down, and any Tau who expressed sympathy for his cause was subject to re-education by the Ethereal Council's representatives. When Commander Shadowson, Farsight's former rival and fellow student of Puritide, learned of his defection, she went to the Montier Battle Dome, the same simulation facility where she and Farsight had competed as students, and destroyed the last remaining statue of Farsight with the fusion blasters of her stealth suit. It was a dramatic gesture, a public declaration of her loyalty to the Empire and her contempt for the traitor who had once been her equal. The public narrative was clear. Farsight was a traitor, and any right-thinking Tau should condemn him. But the private reality was more complicated. Within the Firecast, particularly among the veterans who had served during the Damocles Crusade, Farsight's reputation was not easily tarnished. These were warriors who had fought beside him, who had seen his tactical genius firsthand, who owed their lives to decisions he had made under fire. Many of them could not reconcile the commander they had served with the traitor that the Ethereals described. They did not defect, most of them. They remained loyal to the Empire and to the greater good as the Ethereals defined it. But they kept their opinions about Farsight to themselves. And in the quiet corners of fire academies and barracks and veteran associations, his name was spoken with a respect that the Ethereals would not have approved of. The Ethereals were also forced to confront an uncomfortable practical problem: the Puritide Engram neurochip program. The chips had been designed to preserve the tactical genius of the Empire's greatest commanders. But the greatest commander the Empire had ever produced was now a renegade, and his tactical innovations, the very techniques that had made the Tau military so effective, were being used by the Enclaves rather than the Empire. The Ethereals could not disown Farsight's tactics without weakening their own military. They could not acknowledge his contributions without undermining their narrative of his treachery. They settled for a compromise that satisfied no one. They continued to teach his techniques in the fire academies, stripped of his name and attributed to anonymous sources. The gesture of Shadowsun destroying Farsight's statue was complicated by the fact that Shadowsun, for all her fury, understood Farsight better than almost anyone else alive. She had trained with him. She had competed with him. She had seen his brilliance and his stubbornness and his willingness to question assumptions that everyone else took for granted. She knew that Farsight was not the kind of commander who abandoned his principles lightly. She knew that whatever had driven him to break with the Empire must have been something profound, something that had shaken his understanding of the universe so deeply that he could not reconcile it with the Ethereals' version of the truth. She did not agree with his decision. She believed that the greater good required unity, that the Ethereals were the necessary center of Tau civilization, and that Farsight's rebellion was a dangerous act of arrogance that would ultimately harm both the Enclaves and the Empire. But she understood why he had made it, and that understanding added a layer of complexity to her loyalty that the Ethereals would have found deeply troubling if they had known about it. Meanwhile, in the Enclaves, Farsight was building a military force that would eventually become one of the most formidable in the Eastern Fringe. The core of the Enclave military was the Firecast warriors who had followed Farsight into exile. These were veterans of the Arkanasha War, the Damocles Crusade, and the Farsight Expedition, hardened soldiers who had fought orcs, humans, and things that defied classification. They were by any measure among the most experienced and capable warriors in the Tau species. And at the center of this military was Farsight's personal command unit, a hand-picked team of the finest battlesuit pilots and most trusted advisors in the Enclaves. The Enclaves also inherited a number of the client species that had been absorbed into the greater good during the Tau Empire's expansions. Kroot, Vespid, and small human populations who had joined the Tau during the Second Sphere expansion found themselves in the Enclaves when Farsight made his break. Some of these allied species adapted well to the Enclave's more egalitarian culture. The Kroot, in particular, thrived under Farsight's command, their mercenary traditions and fierce independence fitting naturally into a society that valued individual judgment and martial skill over rigid obedience. Others struggled with the absence of ethereal authority, particularly the Vespid, whose communion helms had been designed by the Ethereals to facilitate communication, and whose loyalty to the ruling caste was deeply integrated into their technology. The Enclave military also developed a distinctive combat philosophy that reflected Farsight's own evolution as a commander. Unlike the main Tau Empire, which maintained a strong doctrinal preference for ranged engagement and avoided close combat whenever possible, the Enclaves trained their warriors in melee techniques adapted for battlesuit combat. Farsight's personal experience, from the canyons of Arkanasha to the ruins of Arthas Moloch, had taught him that there were moments when close combat was not merely unavoidable, but decisive, and he wanted his warriors prepared for those moments. The Enclaves also maintained a more aggressive tactical stance than the Empire, where the main Tau military favored the patient hunter approach, the Kauyon, drawing enemies into prepared kill zones through feigned retreats. The Enclaves favored a blend of Montka, the killing blow. A strategy of overwhelming force applied at the decisive point, with the kind of fluid improvisational warfare that Farsight had pioneered on Arkunasha. The result was a military that was smaller than the Empire's, but per capita, more experienced, more versatile, and more willing to take risks. Farsight himself trained his commanders with the same principles that Puritide had taught him. He emphasized adaptability over doctrine, initiative over obedience, and understanding over memorization. He wanted commanders who could think for themselves, who could assess a situation and make the right decision without waiting for orders, who could adapt their tactics to the reality of the battlefield rather than the theory of the manual. This approach produced commanders who were individually more capable than their Empire counterparts, though the Enclaves could never match the Empire's ability to produce them in quantity. The result was a military that punched far above its weight class. Enclave forces routinely defeated enemies that outnumbered them by margins that conventional analysis would have deemed impossible. They did it through superior individual skill, through tactical creativity, through the kind of aggressive, risk-tolerant decision-making that the Empire's more conservative command culture discouraged. And at the center of this military was Farsight's personal command unit. They called themselves the Eight. The Eight are not a military unit in the conventional sense. They are a brotherhood, a war council, and a legend. 7 warriors gathered around a commander who has held them together through exile, through war, and through the slow, grinding isolation of building a civilization on the edge of nothing. Every member of the Eight has a story. Every one of them is broken in some way, scarred by the experiences that brought them to Farsight's side and bound to him by ties that go deeper than rank or duty. Together, they form the heart of the Farsight Enclaves, the living embodiment of everything that Farsight's rebellion represents. Farsight himself pilots the Red Dawn, a customized X-V8 Crisis battlesuit painted in the deep crimson that has become the symbol of the Enclaves. The suit is equipped with a high-intensity plasma rifle and the Dawn Blade, the ancient alien sword that Farsight took from the ruins of Arthas Moloch. Among the Orcs, Farsight is known as the Red Comet, a figure of terror and grudging respect. The red-painted warrior who falls from the sky and leaves only dead greenskins in his wake. Commander Bravestorm is perhaps the most tragic of the Eight. He was the warrior who charged into the Imperial armored column at Black Thunder Mesa during the Damocles Crusade, wielding the Omega Gauntlet, punching through tank after tank with his battlesuit's fist while pulse fire and cannon shells hammered his armor from every direction. He survived. Barely. His body was so badly damaged that he can never leave his battlesuit, his ruined flesh sustained by the suit's medical systems in a permanent state of half-life. He is, in effect, a Tau dreadnought, a living weapon entombed in a walking coffin, fighting on because the suit will not let him die, and because he does not know how to stop. The Omega Gauntlet is still his primary weapon, and in the decades since Black Thunder Mesa, he has killed more enemies with that armored fist than most fire warriors kill in their entire careers. Commander Shavastos is the Old Warrior. He was the first Tau to receive a Puritide engram neurochip, the experimental device that recorded Commander Puritide's neural patterns and implanted them into the brains of selected commanders. Shavastos accepted the chip willingly, and it made him a formidable tactician, his own instincts augmented by the ghost of the greatest military mind in Tau history. But when the prototype chip began to degrade, the Ethereals ordered its removal, a process that would have left Shavastos brain dead. Farsight intervened, placing Shavastos in stasis until a solution could be found. Years later, Ovesa, the Enclave's chief scientist, recalibrated the neurochip and reawakened the old warrior. Shavastos returned to active duty changed, quieter, more cautious, carrying the echoes of two minds in one skull and fighting with a tactical precision that sometimes feels less like intuition and more like prophecy. Honor Shazovesa is not a warrior at all, at least not by training. He is an Earth-caste scientist, a genius of engineering and biotechnology, whose brilliant mind has been the intellectual engine of the Farsight Enclave since their founding. Ovesa is old, kept alive by microdrones of his own invention that swim through his bloodstream, repairing cellular damage and maintaining his body's functions far beyond the natural lifespan of a Tau. He pilots a modified XV-104 Riptide, one of the largest and most powerful battlesuits in the Tau arsenal, not because he is a skilled pilot, but because the Riptide's systems are so automated that even a non-combat specialist can operate it effectively. And because Ovesa has personally modified his suit to compensate for his lack of combat training with an array of automated targeting systems, drone controllers, and weapons platforms that make him a devastating force on the battlefield despite his Earth-caste origins. Ovesa is the person who understands the Dawnblade better than anyone, including Farsight. He has studied the weapon extensively, analyzing its materials, its energy signatures, and its effects on both physical and non-physical targets. He has not been able to determine exactly how the blade works, but he has developed theories that he has shared with Farsight and that Farsight has not entirely wanted to hear. Commander Brightsword is a legacy. The original Brightsword served alongside Farsight in the Arkonasha War and was one of his earliest and most devoted followers. When the original Brightsword died, another warrior took up the name and the signature weapons, twin fusion blades that can function as both melee weapons and ranged fusion blasters. Since then, the name Brightsword has passed through multiple holders, each one carrying the scarred and pockmarked battlesuit that has become as much a symbol as a weapon. Some accounts suggest that each Brightsword is a new warrior who takes up the mantle. Others, more disturbing, suggest that the successive Brightswords are clones of the original, each one grown from the same genetic template, each one carrying the same instincts and the same ferocity in a body that is technically new but functionally identical. The current Brightsword, the seventh to bear the name, fights with a ferocity that honors every warrior who came before him, or who was him depending on which version of the story you believe. He fights with fusion blades that can cut through the heaviest armor, and he fights with the knowledge that someday another warrior will take up his name and his weapons and continue the legacy. Commander Arakon is the strategist of the group, the battlefield orchestrator who turns Farsight's vision into coordinated action. Born on Violos, he is one of the few members of the Eight who was raised in the Enclaves rather than the Empire, a Tau who has never known ethereal authority and never felt its absence as a loss. During Farsight's years of self-imposed exile in the wastes of Violos, Arakon served as the Enclave's supreme military commander, holding the borders and making the decisions that kept the civilization alive while its founder wandered the desert. He pilots an XV-805 Enforcer battlesuit, a heavier variant of the standard crisis suit, armed with a plasma rifle, a cyclic ion blaster, and an air-bursting fragmentation projector. Arakon is the 8's operational backbone, the commander who turns Farsight's strategic vision into tactical reality. Shazva Obolotai 9-0 is not alive, not in the conventional sense. The original Obolotai was Farsight's mentor in battlesuit combat, the veteran who taught the young Sho the basics of piloting a crisis suit during his time at the Fire Academy. Obolotai was killed during an Orc ambush years ago. His body destroyed in an incident involving an Earth-cast experiment gone catastrophically wrong. But Ovesa, using techniques that the Ethereals would certainly have condemned as dangerously close to the creation of artificial intelligence, preserved Obolotai's neural patterns and installed them in the control systems of an XV-88 broadside battlesuit. The result is a walking weapons platform controlled by an artificial intelligence based on a dead man's brain, an entity that fights with Obolotai's instincts and tactical awareness, but that is, by any strict definition, a machine rather than a person. The rest of the 8 treat Obolotai 9-0 as a comrade, not a tool, but the philosophical implications of his existence are not lost on any of them. In the Tau Empire, the creation of true artificial intelligence is not explicitly forbidden the way it is in the Imperium, but it comes uncomfortably close to a line that most Tau would prefer not to approach. Sub-Commander Torchstar is the youngest of the 8, the most volatile, and in some ways the most representative of what the Enclaves have become. She is a deserter from the main Tau Empire, a fire warrior who abandoned her post and fled to the Enclaves for reasons that she has never fully explained. She carries flame tattoos on her body, an unusual form of personal expression in a culture that values conformity, and she pilots a crisis suit armed with dual flamers that she uses with an enthusiasm that borders on mania. Torchstar fights with a heat and fury that reflects her personality, intense, passionate, and slightly unhinged. She is not the most skilled warrior in the 8, but she may be the most committed, fighting with the desperate intensity of someone who has burned her bridges and has nothing to lose. Each member of the 8 has paid a price for following Farsight. Bravestorm lost his body. Shavastos lost his autonomy to an implant he can never remove. Ovesa lost his caste's identity, an Earth-caste researcher reborn as a warrior he never intended to become. Obolotai lost his life and was brought back as something that might not be a person. Torchstar lost her home and her people, fleeing the Empire for reasons she will not name. Brightsword carries the weight of every warrior who bore his name before him and the knowledge that someday another will bear it after. And Arakon carries the burden of coordinating a military that is permanently outnumbered, permanently outgunned, and permanently one bad campaign away from annihilation. They fight together because they have no one else. The Enclaves are their world. Farsight is their center. The greater good as they define it is their purpose, and the enemies that surround them are the reality they face every time they seal their battlesuits and step onto the launch rails. Together, the 8 are more than a command unit. They are a family, bound by shared experience and mutual loyalty, each one owing their life or their sanity or their purpose to Farsight and to each other. They are the living proof that a Tau community can function, can thrive, can fight and sacrifice and endure without the guiding hand of the Ethereals. And at the center of the Eight, in Farsight's grip, is the weapon that makes all of it possible. The Dawnblade. The Eight fight together in a manner that transcends conventional battlesuit tactics. They move as a single entity, 8 minds coordinating through years of shared experience and a level of trust that no training program can replicate. Farsight leads from the front, his Dawnblade carving the path. Bravestorm follows on his right, the Omega Gauntlet smashing through anything that gets too close. Brightsword guards the left flank, his fusion blades cutting arcs of superheated destruction. Shavastos and Arakon coordinate the mid-range fire, their suits weapons maintaining a constant barrage that keeps the enemy suppressed. Ovasa's Riptide provides heavy support, its ion accelerator punching through vehicles and fortifications that the lighter crisis suits cannot crack. Obolatai 9-0's broadside fills the sky with missiles from the rear, its AI brain calculating firing solutions with a speed and accuracy that no organic pilot could match. And Torchstar ranges freely, her flamers turning anything that flanks the formation into burning wreckage. They have fought together so many times in so many battles against so many different enemies that they no longer need to communicate verbally during combat. Farsight gestures with the Dawnblade, and the Eight respond. A tilt of the sword means advance. A sweep to the left means engage targets on that flank. A raised blade means hold position and fire. A plunging thrust means close to melee range. It is, in its way, beautiful, a dance of war machines, coordinated with the precision of artists and the lethality of apex predators. The enemies of the Farsight enclaves have learnt to fear the sight of 8 battlesuits descending from the sky in formation, the red of Farsight's suit burning like a signal fire at their center. The Dawnblade is a mystery wrapped in a paradox sealed inside a question that Commander Farsight may never be able to answer. The weapon is old. Not old in the way that Tau things are old, not old in the way that human things are old. Old in the way that the galaxy is old in the way that suggests it was forged before the Imperium existed, before humanity mastered fire, before the Eldar danced in their paradise world. The Earthcast researchers who have studied the blade have been unable to determine what it is made of. The alloys do not correspond to any known element or compound. They do not corrode. They do not wear. They do not scratch or chip or degrade in any measurable way. The blade is as sharp today as it was when Farsight pulled it from the statue's grip on Arthas Moloch, and it will, in all probability, be just as sharp in another 10,000 years. The blade cuts through everything: rock, metal, ceramite, adamantium, the blessed armor of space marines and the daemon flesh of warp entities alike. It does not merely cut, it annihilates. Whatever the blade passes through ceases to exist in a way that goes beyond physical destruction. There is no residue, no molecular debris. The matter simply stops being, as though the blade is severing reality itself and leaving nothing behind. When Farsight swings the Dawnblade, it flickers with energy that the Tau's sensors cannot categorize. It is not thermal, not electrical, not any form of radiation that Tau science can identify. It is something else, something that operates on principles that the Earthcast has reluctantly concluded are outside the current boundaries of Tau physics. Ovasa has a theory about what the blade might be made of. He has not confirmed it. He may never be able to confirm it. But he has a word for the property he suspects the alloy possesses. Chronophagic, time-eating. The theory is simple and terrible. The Dawn Blade is made from a material that feeds on time. When it kills, when it cuts short a life, it absorbs the natural lifespan that the victim would have lived, the years that the victim would have experienced, the time that was taken from them by the blade's edge, are transferred to the wielder. The blade steals the future from its victims and gives it to the hand that holds it. This is why Commander Farsight is still alive. Tau have short lives. The Firecast, with their demanding physical lifestyles and the cumulative damage of decades of combat, rarely live past 40 or 50 standard years. Farsight has been alive for over 300. He has outlived every Tau who was born in the same year he was. He has outlived generations of warriors who served under him. He has watched friends grow old and die while he remains, year after year, decade after decade, apparently untouched by the passage of time. He has suspicions about why. He is not a fool, and the correlation between his use of the Dawn Blade and his extraordinary longevity has not escaped his notice. Every major battle he has fought, every campaign where the blade has drunk deep of enemy blood, has been followed by years of continued vitality that his body should not possess. The mathematics are darkly elegant. He has killed thousands of orcs with the Dawn Blade, and orcs are biologically immortal. Creatures that do not age, that grow larger and stronger with time rather than weaker. Every orc killed by the blade represents a potentially infinite lifespan absorbed by the wielder. He has killed daemons with the blade, entities that exist outside of mortal time altogether. If Ovasa's theory is correct, if the blade truly absorbs the remaining lifespan of its victims, then the centuries that Farsight has added to his life through the slaughter of orcs and daemons may be only the beginning. He may, depending on how the blade's properties interact with the nature of his victims, be functionally immortal. This is not a comforting thought. Farsight has never spoken publicly about the Dawn Blade's properties. Within the Eight, the subject is discussed with a frankness that reflects the group's trust in each other. But even there, the conversations are careful, hedged with uncertainty and unease. Ovasa presents his theories with the caution of a scientist who knows that his data is incomplete and his conclusions are speculative. Farsight listens with the focus of a commander assessing a threat assessment, which, in a very real sense, is exactly what this is. Because if the Dawn Blade is keeping Farsight alive by stealing the lives of others, then Farsight's continued existence is built on a foundation of consumed futures. Every year he lives is a year taken from someone else. Every decade of his unnatural lifespan represents dozens of lives cut short by the blade's edge. The Dawn Blade is not merely a weapon, it is a parasite, and Farsight is its host. The moral implications are staggering, and Farsight is aware of every one of them. He continues to use the blade because the alternative is worse. The Dawn Blade is the most effective weapon in the Enclave's arsenal against the creatures of the Warp, and the Warp creatures are the greatest threat that the Enclaves face. Without the blade, Farsight cannot protect his people from the daemons that periodically emerge from the rift zones and warp anomalies that dot the territories beyond the Damocles Gulf. With the blade he can. The cost is measured in enemy lives, and Farsight has decided for now that the lives of orcs and daemons are a price he is willing to pay. But the decision haunts him in his private moments, in the quiet hours between campaigns when the Enclaves are at peace and the blade hangs silent on its rack. Farsight wonders what the weapon is doing to him. Not physically, Physically, he is in extraordinary condition for a Tau of any age, let alone one who has lived for 3 centuries. He wonders what it is doing to him, spiritually, if a species as psychically dim as the Tau can be said to have a spiritual dimension at all. He wonders whether the blade chose him, there on Arthas Moloch, in the chaos of the Daemon attack, when he was dying and desperate and reached for the nearest weapon without thinking. He wonders whether the blade called to him, whether it exerted some influence that drew him to it, whether the feeling of familiarity he experienced when he first saw the ruins was not coincidence but compulsion. He wonders, in his darkest moments, whether the blade is not a tool, but a trap. Whether it was left on Arthas Moloch precisely for someone like him to find, whether whatever entity or civilization created it intended exactly this outcome. A warrior bound to a weapon that keeps him alive only as long as he keeps killing. A champion who cannot stop fighting, because stopping would mean death. A leader whose immortality is purchased at a price that grows with every passing year. These are questions without answers, and Farsight, who has built his life on the principle that questions should be investigated rather than avoided, has learned to live with their weight. He carries the Dawnblade into every battle, and with each stroke the weapon feeds, and with each feeding, Farsight's life extends a little further into a future that he is no longer certain he wants to see. But he keeps fighting, because his people need him, because the enclaves cannot survive without his leadership, because the threats that surround them, orcs, humans, tyrannids, and the things that should not exist, will not wait for him to resolve his philosophical crisis. And because, in the final analysis, Commander Farsight would rather fight with a cursed weapon than let his people die without one. There is a loneliness to immortality that Farsight has never spoken of publicly and rarely acknowledges even in private. Tau lives are short. A Tau warrior who fights beside Farsight today will be dead of old age in 30 years. The friends, the comrades, the subordinates who share his battles and his counsel will fade and fail and die while Farsight remains unchanged, untouched by the years that consume everyone around him. He has already outlived everyone he trained with at the Viola Academy. He has outlived every Tau who fought beside him at Arkunasha. He has outlived Puritide, the teacher who shaped him. He has outlived generations of warriors who followed him into exile, who believed in his cause, who fought and died for the enclaves without ever knowing that their commander would still be fighting long after their bones had turned to dust. The Dawnblade gives him time. It does not give him the ability to share that time with the people he cares about. This is the Blade's cruelest gift, not the years it adds, but the isolation those years create. Farsight stands at the center of a community that he built and that he leads, surrounded by people who respect him and follow him and perhaps love him. And he knows that he will bury every one of them. He will stand at their memorials and speak words of honor and loss, and then he will turn away and continue fighting, because the Blade will not let him stop, and the galaxy will not let him rest. 300 years is a long time to be alone in a crowd. That is the choice. It has always been the choice. And the Dawnblade, humming with stolen time, does not care one way or the other. There is another dimension to the Dawnblade story that bears examination, because it connects Farsight's personal mystery to one of the largest mysteries in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. What made the Dawnblade? The weapon is not Tau. It is not human. It is not Eldar, not Orc, not Tyrannid. not any of the recognizable Xenos species that inhabit the galaxy in the 41st millennium. Ovasa's analysis of the blade's materials has confirmed that it was manufactured using techniques and elements that do not correspond to any known civilization's technology. What is known is that the Dawnblade was fashioned by whatever Xenos species once inhabited Arthas Moloch, a civilization so old and so vanished that nothing remains of it but the faceless statues and the hexagrammic symbols carved into the ruins. The Tau have no idea who these beings were. No other species in the galaxy has claimed them. They are simply gone, erased by time, or by the same forces that purged their world. And the Dawnblade is one of the last things they left behind. Among the few who have speculated about the blade's origins, some have suggested a connection to the Necrons, the ancient machine race whose technology routinely manipulates time and dimensional physics. The Khitan, the star gods that the Necrons served and eventually enslaved, were known to possess abilities that included temporal distortion. A weapon made from chronophagic alloys is at least consistent with the kinds of reality-bending technology that Necron artifacts have displayed. But the theory is unconfirmed, and it raises as many questions as it answers. The ruins of Arthas Moloch bear no other signs of Necron habitation. The faceless statues do not match any known Necron design, and the blade's devastating effectiveness against daemons does not fit easily into the Necron technological profile. The truth is that no one, not Farsight, not Ovisa, not the Imperium's Inquisitors, knows what made the Dawnblade or why. The chronophagic properties of the blade also raise a deeply uncomfortable question about the nature of time in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. If time can be consumed, if a natural lifespan is a finite quantity of temporal energy that can be transferred from one vessel to another, then time is not a universal constant, but a resource. A currency, something that can be hoarded, spent, stolen, and accumulated. The Necrons understood this. Their technology routinely manipulates temporal mechanics in ways that defy human and Tau physics alike. Necron chronomancers can reverse entropy in localized areas, restoring damaged structures to their original condition. Necron temporal weapons can age a target to dust in seconds, or trap them in a loop of repeated moments that lasts for eternity. The Khitan, the star gods that the Necrons once served, were beings of such cosmic power that the flow of time itself was merely another variable they could adjust. A weapon made from chronophagic alloys, forged by a civilization that understood time as a manipulable substance, is entirely consistent with the technological capabilities of the Necrons or their predecessors. But it also suggests a level of intentionality that is troubling. A weapon that steals time and gives it to its wielder is not a weapon of war. It is a weapon of enslavement. It binds its wielder to an immortality that can only be sustained through violence, creating a cycle of killing and survival that feeds on itself, that grows more addictive with each use, that becomes harder to abandon the longer it continues. Is the Dawnblade a gift? Or is it a leash? These questions remain unanswered. They may always remain unanswered. The galaxy is full of artifacts from civilizations that no longer exist. Weapons and tools and structures left behind by species that rose and fell in the vast, unrecorded eons before humanity crawled out of its caves and looked up at the stars. The Dawnblade may be one such artifact, a relic of a war so old that the participants have been forgotten, a weapon that has outlasted its makers and its purpose and its context. persisting through the ages until it found a new hand to wield it and a new purpose to serve. Or it may be something worse, something intended. Something that was placed on Arthas Moloch with full knowledge that someone, someday, would find it and take it up and be bound by its power. Farsight does not know. He may never know. And in the silence of that uncertainty, the blade waits, patient and hungry, ready for the next battle and the next feeding and the next stolen lifetime added to the count. And then Commander Farsight did something that no one expected. He left, shortly after setting the foundations of the enclaves. After establishing the governance structures and the military hierarchies and the industrial capacity that would allow his new civilization to survive, Farsight announced his intention to step down from the elemental council he had created. He judged himself unworthy. He had seen too much on Arthas Moloch. The experience had changed him in ways that he was not certain he understood, and he feared that whatever influence the Dawnblade or the warp creatures might have exerted on him could compromise his ability to lead. He abandoned his battlesuit. He left the Dawnblade in Ovasa's care for study. And he walked out into the wastelands of Viorlos, the capital world of the Enclaves, a volcanic planet of salty seas and scorching heat, and he disappeared. His self-imposed exile lasted decades. He wandered the great equatorial plains of Viorlos, living in the barren savanna, seeking a natural death that refused to come. The Dawnblade had already done its work. Even without the weapon in his hands, the years it had stolen from the orcs and daemons on Arthas Moloch sustained him. He aged slowly, then not at all, while the wilderness of Viorlos failed to kill him despite his best efforts to let it. During his absence, the Enclaves were led by Commander Arakon, who served as supreme military commander, and by the elemental council of advisors that Farsight had appointed. The Enclaves survived. They defended their borders. They developed their infrastructure. They proved, in the most direct way possible, that they could function not only without the Ethereals, but without Farsight himself. Then the Tyranids came, a tendril of a hive fleet, pushed into the Enclave's territory from the galactic east. The creatures invaded Viorlos itself, and the threat was existential. Farsight, encountering Tyranid organisms in the wastelands where he had been wandering for years, realized that his exile was over. His people needed him, not as a philosopher or a penitent, as a commander. He returned to the Vascorian Colosseum, a war museum on Viorlos that held his battlesuit and the Dawnblade. The staff did not recognize him at first. They did not believe he was who he claimed to be, because the commander they remembered should have been long dead. But the battlesuit fit, and the Dawnblade hummed when his manipulator claw closed around it, and Commander Farsight led the 8 into battle once more. The Tyranid invasion was repulsed. The Enclaves held. And Farsight, restored to command, did not return to the wilderness. The galaxy was too dangerous, the threats too numerous, and his people too vulnerable for him to indulge the luxury of exile. The centuries since that return have not been kind. Farsight's breakaway civilization exists in one of the most dangerous regions of the galaxy, the space beyond the Damocles Gulf, surrounded by Orc empires, Tyranid tendrils, Necron tomb worlds, and the ever-present threat of Imperial incursion. The Enclaves are smaller than the Tau Empire. They have fewer resources, fewer soldiers, fewer ships, and no access to the vast industrial base that the Empire's alliance with its client species provides. They are, by every objective measure, outmatched by almost every enemy they face. They survive because Farsight is Farsight. His tactical genius, the same gift that earned him his name on Arkanasha and his reputation during the Damocles Crusade, has been the Enclave's primary weapon for 300 years. Farsight fights smarter than his enemies. He maneuvers better than they do. He reads the battlefield with an intuition that 3 centuries of combat experience have honed to a razor's edge. He knows the Orc's psychology, the Imperium's doctrine, the Tyrannid's adaptive patterns, and the strange fractured logic of the Necron awakening protocols. He has fought them all, and he has learned something from every engagement. But genius alone is not enough. The Enclave's survival depends on a combination of Farsight's leadership, the technological innovations of Ovesa and the Earthcast, and the sheer stubborn determination of a population that has chosen freedom and refuses to give it up. The Enclave's relationship with the main Tau Empire has evolved over the centuries from active hostility to a complicated, unofficial coexistence. The Ethereal Council has never rescinded its declaration that Farsight is a traitor. The ban on communications with the Enclaves remains officially in place. Farsight's name is still forbidden in the sept worlds of the Empire, and any Tau who attempts to defect to the Enclaves risks severe punishment. But the reality on the ground is more nuanced than the official position suggests. The Enclaves serve as a buffer between the Tau Empire and the threats that lie beyond the Gulf. When a major Orc Wa'arg or a Tyrannid splinter fleet moves through the region, it hits the Enclaves first, and the Enclave's military, forged in decades of constant warfare, absorbs the blow that might otherwise strike the Empire's eastern frontier. The Ethereals may not acknowledge this publicly, but they are pragmatic enough to recognize its value. There have been moments of direct cooperation, though both sides have been reluctant to admit it. During the Third Sphere expansion, when Commander Shadowson was leading the Tau Empire's major push into new territory, there were engagements where Enclave forces and Empire forces fought alongside each other against common enemies, their differences temporarily set aside in the face of threats that neither could handle alone. These alliances of necessity were always temporary and always complicated. During the Second Agrellan campaign, Farsight brought the full strength of the Enclaves to fight alongside Shadowsoon against Imperial forces, and together the 2 greatest students of Puritide managed an effective but ultimately doomed resistance. Their tactical styles complemented each other as they always had. Shadowsoon's patient Kauyon balanced Farsight's aggressive Montka, and together they could dismantle forces that would have overwhelmed either of them individually. But when the fighting ended, the Ethereal Council ordered Shadowsoon to capture Farsight. She obeyed the letter of the order, but not its spirit, secretly leaking the capture order to Farsight to give him a head start. It was a small act of defiance, buried beneath layers of plausible deniability, but it revealed something important about Shadowsoon's feelings toward her former rival, the underlying tension never resolved. Shadowsoon believed in the Ethereals. Farsight did not. Shadowsoon believed that Tau civilization required the guiding hand of the ruling caste to function. Farsight had proved over 3 centuries that it did not. Their disagreement was not personal. It was structural, philosophical, a fundamental divergence in their understanding of what it meant to be Tau and what the greater good required. In the broader galactic context, the Farsight Enclaves occupy a peculiar position. They are too small to be a major power, but too effective to be ignored. The Imperium regards them with a mixture of contempt and concern. Some Imperial strategists dismiss the Enclaves as an irrelevant splinter of an irrelevant Xenos species. Others, particularly within the Inquisition, are more worried. The Enclaves represent a Tau civilization that has been exposed to chaos and has survived. A Xenos power that knows about the warp's true nature and has developed at least rudimentary defenses against it. This makes the Enclaves potentially more dangerous than the main Tau Empire. Because a species that understands its enemy is always more threatening than one that does not. The Necrons, awakening in increasing numbers across the eastern fringe, are another constant threat. Tomb worlds in the territories surrounding the Enclaves have activated periodically, disgorging Necron warriors into regions that the Enclaves have settled or depend upon for resources. Farsight has fought Necrons on multiple occasions, and these engagements have been among the most challenging of his long career. Necron technology outclasses anything the Tau possess, and the Necron's ability to self-repair, to teleport, to phase in and out of material existence makes them extraordinarily difficult to engage using Tau tactics that were designed for enemies that stay dead when you shoot them. The Tyranids represent yet another existential threat. The eastern fringe, where the Enclaves are located, is one of the primary approach vectors for Tyranid hive fleets entering the galaxy from the intergalactic void. The Enclaves have faced Tyranid incursions on multiple occasions, and these engagements have tested Farsight's tactical genius to its absolute limits. The Tyranids are unlike any other enemy the Tau have faced. They do not think like orcs or humans or Necrons. They do not have individual leaders to assassinate or morale to break or supply lines to cut. They are a single organism, a hive mind that controls trillions of biological weapons, with a collective intelligence that adapts to every tactic the Tau deploy against it. Against the Tyranids, Farsight has had to invent entirely new approaches to warfare, approaches that exploit the hive mind's vulnerabilities rather than trying to overwhelm its strengths. He has studied the Tyranid synapse creatures, the specialized organisms that serve as psychic relay points for the hive mind's control, and has developed tactics that target these synapse nodes, disrupting the hive mind's control over its forces and causing the lesser creatures to revert to mindless, instinctual behavior. It is a strategy that works, but only temporarily, because the hive mind adapts. Every tactic that Farsight deploys against the Tyranids becomes less effective with each use, as the hive mind learns to compensate and counter. It is a war of constant innovation, a race between Farsight's creativity and the Tyranids' evolution. And through all of this, through every battle, every campaign, every year that should have been his last but somehow was not, the Dawnblade has been at Farsight's side, glowing, hungry, patient. The deeper philosophical implications of the Farsight Enclave's existence are perhaps the most interesting aspect of their story, because they challenge the fundamental assumptions not just of Tau civilization but of the Warhammer 40,000 universe as a whole. The Tau Empire operates on the premise that collective welfare requires collective obedience, that the greater good can only be achieved through the subordination of individual judgment to the wisdom of the ruling caste. This premise is the justification for the Ethereals' authority, for the caste system's rigidity, for the philosophical foundation that has guided the Tau through their rapid rise from a Stone Age species to an interstellar empire. Farsight's Enclaves challenge this premise by existing, by functioning, by thriving in their limited way. in conditions that the Empire's theorists would consider impossible for a Tau civilization without ethereal guidance. The Enclaves demonstrate that the greater good does not require the Ethereals, that Tau can cooperate, can sacrifice, can serve a collective purpose without the biochemical compulsion that the ruling caste exerts. This is why the Ethereals fear Farsight more than any external enemy. An Orc-Wa'ar can be defeated, an Imperial crusade can be resisted, a Tyranid hive fleet can be diverted. But the idea that the Ethereals are not necessary, cannot be fought with pulse rifles and battlesuits. It can only be suppressed, and suppression, as history has shown across every civilization that has ever attempted it, is never permanent. The question of whether the Ethereals' control is a form of benevolent guidance or a form of slavery is one that the Tau as a species have never been able to ask, because the Ethereals' influence prevents them from formulating the question. The Enclaves, free from that influence, have asked it. And the answer they have arrived at, the answer that Farsight has demonstrated through 3 centuries of independent existence, is troubling for the Empire. The answer is that the Tau do not need the Ethereals to be good. They do not need to be compelled to cooperate, to sacrifice, to serve the collective. Given the choice, free from the subtle pressure that the Ethereals exert, most Tau will still choose the greater good, not because they are forced to, but because they believe in it. Because it is, beneath the politics and the control and the manipulation, a genuinely good idea. Farsight has not rejected the greater good. This is the point that the Ethereals and their propagandists consistently miss in their portrayal of the Farsight enclaves. Farsight has rejected the Ethereals' monopoly on defining what the greater good means. He has rejected the idea that the greater good requires a ruling caste that exerts influence over its subjects' minds. He has rejected the premise that the Tau people are children who need to be guided rather than adults who can make their own choices. This is what makes Farsight dangerous, not his military genius, though that is formidable, not the Dawnblade, though that is terrifying, not the Enclave's military strength, though that is significant. What makes Farsight dangerous is the proof, written in 3 centuries of independent Tau civilization, that the Ethereal's authority is not the foundation of Tau society. It is the cage, and on the far side of the Damocles Gulf, Commander Farsight has shown his people that the door was never locked. The story of Farsight is at its heart a story about what happens when a good soldier discovers that the system he serves is built on a lie. This is not a unique story in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The Horus Heresy was, at its core, about the same thing. Sons discovering that the father they trusted had hidden the truth from them, and the catastrophic consequences of that discovery. The difference is scale. The heresy destroyed an empire. Farsight's rebellion created one. Horus fell to chaos. Farsight fell to freedom, and where Horus's story ended in tragedy, in madness, in the destruction of everything he had once fought for, Farsight's story continues. Open-ended, unresolved. A question that the Tau Empire cannot answer and cannot stop asking. Is it possible for a civilization to be governed by truth? Is it possible for a ruling class to trust its people with the full, unfiltered reality of the universe they inhabit? Or does survival require ignorance, require the careful management of information, require the benevolent tyranny of leaders who know what their subjects cannot be allowed to know? The Imperium answers this question one way. The Emperor built his empire on a lie, the imperial truth, which denied the existence of the warp's dangers, and the Imperium paid for that lie with 10,000 years of suffering. The Tau Empire answers it the same way, with different details but the same essential structure. The Ethereals control information, manage perception, and present their people with a version of reality that is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. Farsight answers it differently. He says, "Give them the truth. Trust them with it. Let them be afraid, let them be angry, let them be confused, but do not lie to them." The truth is not comfortable. The truth about the warp, about the chaos gods, about the things that lurk in the spaces between dimensions is terrifying. But a people armed with the truth can prepare for the threats they face. A people kept in ignorance can only hope that the threats do not find them. Hope is not a strategy. Farsight learned that on Arthas Moloch, when the things that should not exist came pouring through a tear in reality and his people died because they had never been told such things were possible. The galaxy does not stand still. The wars continue. The threats multiply. The Great Rift has torn reality apart, and its effects reach even to the far eastern fringe where the enclaves make their stand. Warp anomalies are increasing. Demonic incursions are growing more frequent. The enemies that Farsight first encountered on Arthas Moloch, the creatures that the Tau had no name for and no defense against, are appearing in the Enclave's territories with a regularity that suggests something is changing in the fabric of the universe itself. Farsight watches, he plans, he adapts, he fights. The Enclave's population has grown over the centuries, not dramatically, not at the rate that the main Tau Empire expands, but steadily. Tau who hear the rumors, who learn fragments of the truth about the Enclaves, who become dissatisfied with ethereal authority for reasons of their own, occasionally make the dangerous journey across the Damocles Gulf to join Farsight's civilization. Some are firecast warriors seeking the kind of combat freedom that the Empire's doctrine denies them. Some are earthcast scientists pursuing research that the Ethereals have deemed forbidden. Some are watercast administrators who have asked too many questions and been given too few answers. They arrive with nothing. They leave behind their sept, their family connections, their rank, their status, everything that defines a Tau's place in the Empire's rigid social hierarchy. And they find in the Enclave something that the Empire cannot offer: a choice. The choice is not easy. The Enclaves are poorer, more dangerous, more uncertain than the Empire. Life in the Enclaves is harder, the threats are closer, the margin for error is thinner, but the choice is real. In the Enclaves, every Tau decides for themselves what the greater good means. And that freedom, that terrifying, exhilarating, exhausting freedom, is the Enclave's greatest weapon and their most valuable treasure. Farsight is 3 centuries old. He should be long dead, a footnote in Tau history, a name forgotten by a species that measures its memories in decades rather than centuries. Instead, he is alive. Vigorous, sharp, his mind as keen as the blade at his side. He has outlived every Tau who ever knew him as a student, as a young commander, as the hero of Arkunasha. He has outlived most of the Tau who knew him as a traitor. He has become, in a species with no concept of immortality, something very close to immortal. And he keeps fighting. Not because the Dawnblade demands it, though perhaps it does, not because his people need him, though they certainly do. Not because the enemies of the enclaves will never stop coming, though they never will. He fights because he has seen what the universe contains. He has looked through the tear in reality on Arthas Moloch and seen the things that wait on the other side. He has held a weapon that should not exist and used it to kill creatures that should not be real. He has learned truths about the galaxy that the Ethereals have spent centuries hiding, and he knows that ignorance is not protection. It is vulnerability. Commander Farsight fights because someone has to. Because the greater good, the real greater good, not the sanitized version that the Ethereals present to their obedient subjects, demands that someone stand between the Tau and the horrors that the Ethereals pretend do not exist. He fights because, in a galaxy of monsters and gods and cosmic horrors, a single warrior with a stolen sword and a stolen lifespan and a handful of exiles is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. It is the choice to face the truth instead of hiding from it. The choice to protect your people instead of controlling them. The choice to fight for what is right even when the rulers of your own civilization have declared you wrong. Commander Farsight did not choose exile. He chose honesty. He chose to acknowledge the things that the Ethereals would not, to prepare for the threats that the Empire refused to see, and to trust his people with the truth rather than wrapping them in comfortable lies. The Ethereals call him the Great Traitor. His people call him the Far-Seeing One. The Orcs call him the Red Comet. The Imperium calls him a Xenos warlord of uncertain significance. The truth is simpler than any of those names. He is a warrior who found a sword that will not let him die. He is a leader who discovered that his masters were liars. He is a general who built a nation from the wreckage of everything he once believed. And he is still fighting 300 years into a war that has no end, on the edge of a galaxy that offers no mercy and asks for none in return. The Farsight enclaves stand, not because they are strong, though they are. Not because they are right, though they may be. They stand because the warrior who leads them has decided that standing is the only option. That falling back is surrender, that giving up, returning to the Empire, accepting the Ethereals' authority and their lies and their comfortable prison, would be a betrayal of every Tau who followed him into exile and every Tau who died in the service of a greater good that was not defined by masters, but earned by equals. The blade glows in the dark. The red battlesuit stands ready. The far-seeing eyes scan the horizon for the next threat, and the next after that. He has been doing this for 300 years. He will do it for 300 more if the blade demands it. And somewhere in the halls of the Ethereal Council, in the silent chambers where the rulers of the Tau Empire make their plans and keep their secrets, they know the truth that they will never speak aloud. They are not afraid of the Orcs. They are not afraid of the humans. They are not afraid of the Tyranids or the Necrons or the things that crawl through the cracks in reality. They are afraid of Commander Farsight. Because Commander Farsight proved that the Tau do not need them. And in a civilization built on the premise that they do, that is the one truth that cannot be allowed to spread. Good night.